For centuries, Zen monks and masters watched how the human mind creates its own suffering, and they discovered some remarkable truths about finding peace. Tonight, we're going to explore these truths. These are not rules to follow or goals to achieve, but gentle reminders of what you may already know deep down. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Zen Buddhism doesn't ask you to believe anything special or become anyone different. It simply invites you to see clearly what's actually happening, right here, right now. Most of our distress comes not from our circumstances, but from how we relate to our circumstances. And that relationship can shift. You don't need to concentrate hard or try to remember everything. These teachings work in their own way, settling into understanding without effort. As you listen, you might notice your breathing slowing down. You might feel your body releasing tension you didn't know you were holding. This happens naturally when the mind encounters something true. So relax. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin our journey together. One of the most common sources of human suffering is also one of the most invisible. We hold on to things. Not just physical objects, but ideas, outcomes, relationships, versions of how life should be. We grip them tightly, believing that our happiness depends on keeping them exactly as they are. This holding is what Zen Buddhism calls attachment. It's different from caring about something or valuing it. Attachment is the belief that we must possess something permanently, that we must control it, that our well-being depends on it, never changing. And because everything in life does change, this attachment guarantees disappointment. We attach to pleasant experiences, wanting them to last forever. We attach to comfortable circumstances, resisting when they shift. We attach to people, forgetting that everyone grows and changes. We even attach to our suffering, building identities around our pain and then clinging to those identities as if they define us. The strange thing about attachment is that it doesn't actually help us enjoy what we have. In fact, it often prevents true enjoyment. When we're holding something tightly, afraid of losing it, we're not really experiencing it. We're too busy worrying about its eventual loss. Zen teaching shows us a different way. Not detachment, which sounds cold and distant, but a kind of open-handed appreciation. Enjoying fully while understanding that nothing stays the same. Loving completely while knowing that all things change form. This understanding doesn't diminish our experience. It enriches it. In a small temple at the edge of a forest, there lived a Zen master named Tenzo. He was known throughout the region for his simplicity and his calm presence. But those who knew him well also knew about his teacup. This teacup was nothing special to look at. Plain ceramic, slightly uneven in shape, with a pale green glaze that had darkened over years of use. But it had belonged to Tenzo's teacher, who had given it to him decades ago on the day Tenzo completed his training. Every morning, Tenzo would prepare tea and drink it from this cup. He washed it carefully after each use. He kept it on a special shelf in his small room. Students noticed how his hands would cradle the cup gently, how his attention would settle when he held it. One autumn morning, a young monk named Kensho arrived at the temple. He had traveled far and was eager to begin his studies. Tenzo welcomed him warmly and showed him around the simple grounds. When they entered Tenzo's room, the master went to prepare tea for his guest. As Tenzo reached for his teacup, his sleeve caught on another bowl. The teacup tipped from the shelf and fell to the wooden floor. It shattered into several pieces. Kensho froze, horrified. He had just arrived and already caused his teacher to lose something precious. He opened his mouth to apologize, to offer to replace it somehow, to explain that he hadn't meant to crowd the doorway. But Tenzo simply looked at the broken pieces on the floor. His face was calm, perhaps even peaceful. He bent down and picked up the largest fragment, turning it slowly in his hand. "How beautiful it was," he said quietly. "All these years it held my tea. Every morning, the warmth of the liquid, the taste of the leaves. It served its purpose perfectly." He gathered the other pieces and placed them in his palm. "My teacher gave me this cup 30 years ago. I've drunk from it every morning since. And now it has completed its journey as a cup. It was whole for exactly as long as it needed to be." Kensho didn't know what to say. "Master, I'm so sorry. It was precious to you." "It was precious," Tenzo agreed. "And now it's something else. These pieces are also precious. They remind me that my teacher is gone, the cup is gone, and someday I will be gone too. Everything passes. This is how things are." He picked up another bowl from the shelf, an ordinary one that students used. "Tomorrow I'll drink my tea from this bowl instead. It will do the same job. And I'll remember my teacher when I drink, just as I always have. The memory lives in me, not in the ceramic." Tenzo prepared tea using the simple bowl and offered it to Kensho. They sat together in silence. The broken pieces lay nearby, and Kensho kept glancing at them, still feeling the weight of what had happened. "You're wondering if I'm sad," Tenzo said after a while. "Yes, Master. I feel the sadness of knowing the cup is gone. That feeling is natural and honest. But I'm not suffering over it. The suffering would come if I insisted it shouldn't have broken, if I demanded that it still be whole, if I spent my energy wishing reality were different than it is." He took a sip of tea from the ordinary bowl. "The cup breaking is just what happened. My teacher dying was just what happened. One day, my own death will be just what happens. When we stop fighting with what happens, something in us becomes very quiet." Later that day, Tenzo placed the broken pieces in his garden among the stones and moss. Over time, they settled into the earth, becoming part of the landscape. Students who came years later never knew about the teacup, but they all noticed something about Tenzo. He held things lightly. He appreciated beauty without clinging to it. He loved without demanding permanence. When students would ask him about non-attachment, he would sometimes bring them to the garden and show them where the broken cup had been, now nearly invisible among the natural elements. "I loved that cup," he would say. And loving it didn't require keeping it forever. The love was real. The loss was real. Both are part of how things are. Neither one needs to create suffering. This story touches something important about the nature of attachment. Tenzo's sadness about the cup breaking was genuine. He had cared for this object, valued it, connected it with memories of his teacher. The feeling of loss was natural and appropriate. But notice what he didn't do. He didn't turn that natural sadness into suffering by insisting reality should be different. He didn't rage against the breaking, didn't blame Kensho, didn't spend days wishing he could undo what happened. He simply acknowledged what was true. The cup had broken. This was the reality now. There's a fundamental insight here about the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is what life brings us. Loss, disappointment, change, these are built into existence. Everything that comes together eventually comes apart. Everything born eventually dies. Everything created eventually breaks. This is simply how things are, and the pain of these natural losses is unavoidable. But suffering is what we add through our resistance. When we fight with reality, insisting it should be different than it is, we create an extra layer of distress on top of the natural pain. We take a moment of loss and extend it into days or years of suffering by constantly replaying how things should have been different. Tenzo's way shows another possibility. We can feel the natural sadness of loss without adding the suffering of resistance. We can acknowledge that something precious is gone without spending our energy demanding that it return. This doesn't mean we don't care. It means we care without clinging. The broken cup settling into the garden is a powerful image. What we've lost doesn't disappear. It changes form. It becomes part of the landscape of our life, part of the soil from which new things grow. But this can only happen when we let go of insisting it remain in its old form. There's another dimension to attachment that shows up differently. Sometimes we cling not to objects but to outcomes, to how we think things should unfold. In a village known for its skilled craftspeople, there was a woodcarver named Isamu. He had learned his trade from his father and had spent 30 years perfecting his skill. He could carve intricate scenes into panels of cedar and cypress. His work decorated temples and wealthy homes throughout the province. Isamu took great pride in his precision. Every cut had to be exact. Every detail had to match his vision perfectly. He would spend months on a single panel, adjusting and refining until it met his exacting standards. His reputation was built on this perfectionism, and he protected it fiercely. One spring, a merchant commissioned Isamu to create a large panel depicting a mountain landscape for a new temple. The merchant described exactly what he wanted: a specific mountain, certain trees in the foreground, a particular waterfall. Isamu accepted the commission and began planning the piece. For weeks, he studied the mountain, sketching it from different angles. He selected the finest piece of cedar he could find, completely free of knots or irregularities. He sharpened his tools until they could split a hair. He prepared his workshop, eliminating any distractions. Finally, he began carving. The work went well. The mountain took shape under his hands, the trees emerged from the wood, the waterfall seemed to flow down the panel. Isamu worked with complete focus, often forgetting to eat or sleep. This was to be his masterpiece, the work that would secure his legacy. After 2 months of intensive carving, the panel was nearly complete. Isamu stepped back to examine it in the morning light. It was perfect. Every line was exactly where it should be. Every detail matched his vision. He felt a deep satisfaction, already imagining the merchant's reaction, the praise from other craftspeople, the enhanced reputation this would bring. That afternoon, as Isamu was preparing to do the final finishing work, his young nephew came to visit. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, excited to see his uncle's workshop. Isamu was usually careful about keeping children away from his workspace, but he was in such a good mood about the nearly finished panel that he let the boy enter. "Can I help?" the nephew asked, eyes wide at all the tools and wood shavings. "Just watch," Isamu said, smiling. This is very delicate work." He turned back to the panel, selecting the finishing tool. Behind him, his nephew picked up a carving gouge from the workbench, mimicking his uncle's movements. The boy stepped closer to see better, and his hand, still holding the tool, swung toward the panel. The gouge bit into the wood, cutting a deep, jagged line across the waterfall, completely destroying that section of the carving. Isamu spun around at the sound. For a moment, he couldn't process what he was seeing. 2 months of work. His masterpiece. Ruined by a child's careless movement. The rage that rose in him was immediate and overwhelming. His face flushed. His hands clenched. He opened his mouth to shout at the boy, to release all the fury and devastation he felt. But then he saw his nephew's face. The child's eyes were filling with tears. His small body was frozen in terror. The boy looked at the ruined panel, then at his uncle, then back at the panel. "I'm sorry," the child whispered. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Something in Isamu broke in that moment, but it wasn't anger. It was something else. He looked at this terrified child, then at the panel, then back at the child. And suddenly, the situation looked completely different. It was a piece of wood. He had carved it skillfully, yes, but it was still just wood. It could be carved again. His nephew was a living child, already learning that mistakes bring harsh punishment, already developing the fear and shame that would follow him through life if Isamu responded with rage right now. Which was more important? The perfect panel or this child's trust? His reputation or his nephew's well-being? The outcome he had demanded or the actual moment in front of him? Isamu took a long breath. Then another. He put down his tool and knelt so he was at eye level with his nephew. "It's all right," he said quietly. The boy stared at him, disbelieving. "It's just wood," Isamu continued. "You didn't mean to damage it. And I should have been more careful about where I left sharp tools when a child was in the room." "But all your work," the nephew said, tears spilling over. "I can carve it again. I've learned the mountain now. The second version will probably be better anyway." Isamu surprised himself by realizing this was true. He had learned so much in creating the first panel that a second attempt would benefit from that experience. He stood and examined the damage. The gouge mark was deep and ugly, cutting right through what had been the most beautiful section of the carving. There was no fixing it. The panel was ruined. "You know what?" Isamu said. "I've been carving for 30 years and every single panel has been exactly what I planned. Perfect. Controlled. Maybe that's made my work a little stiff, a little lifeless. Let me try something different." Over the next few days, instead of starting over, Isamu worked with the damaged panel. He incorporated the gouge mark into the design, turning it into a lightning strike hitting the waterfall. He carved the wood around it to show the energy of the strike, the disruption it caused in the water's flow. The perfect, controlled landscape became something more dynamic, more alive. When the merchant came to see the finished work, he stood before it in silence for a long time. "This is not what I asked for," he finally said. Isamu's heart sank. Of course. The man had paid for a specific design, and Isamu had failed to deliver it. "But it's far better," the merchant continued. "There's something in this piece that wasn't in your other work. Life. Movement. The unexpected. "I'll pay you double." Isamu declined the extra payment, but he kept thinking about what the merchant had said. Something about that accident, that moment when his perfect plan was destroyed, had forced him to create differently. Without the rigid attachment to his original vision, something freer had emerged. Years later, Isamu's style had changed completely. He still carved skillfully, but he no longer demanded absolute control over the outcome. He would let the wood guide him, following the grain rather than fighting against it. He would incorporate accidents rather than treating them as disasters. His work became known not for its precision, but for its vitality. When students asked him about his technique, he would tell them about the lightning strike panel, about his nephew's mistake, about the moment he had to choose between his attachment to a perfect outcome and the reality of what was. "I used to think skill meant controlling everything," he would say. "Now I understand that real mastery is knowing when to guide and when to follow. The wood has its own nature. Life has its own flow. Fighting with that creates rigidity. Working with it creates something alive." Isamu's story reveals another face of attachment. He wasn't clinging to an object, but to an outcome, to a vision of how things should be. His entire sense of self was wrapped up in creating perfect work according to his exact plans. When reality disrupted those plans, he had a choice: fight with what happened or work with it. The moment when he chose not to shout at his nephew was the moment his attachment began to release. In that space between the ruined panel and his response, he saw something clearly. His attachment to perfection was creating rigidity not just in his work, but in how he related to life itself. Notice what happened when he let go of demanding things be exactly as he had planned. He didn't become careless or stop trying to do good work. Instead, his work actually improved. The rigid control that came from attachment had been limiting him. When he released that control, something more alive could emerge. This points to a paradox that runs through Zen teaching. The things we grip most tightly are often the things we damage through our gripping. The outcomes we try hardest to force are often the ones that remain most elusive. Attachment creates a kind of desperate energy that prevents the natural unfolding of things. When we release attachment, we don't lose our connection to what we care about. We actually experience it more fully. Isamu didn't stop caring about his work when he stopped demanding perfect control. He began caring about it in a deeper, freer way. His work became an expression of engagement with reality rather than an attempt to force reality into a predetermined shape. Both Tenzo and Isamu show us that letting go of attachment isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's about loving things, working with things, valuing things without needing them to be permanent or controllable. This open-handed way of living doesn't diminish our experience. It enhances it, removing the layer of fear and desperation that attachment always carries with it. As you settle into rest tonight, you might notice what you've been holding too tightly. Perhaps an idea about how things should be. Perhaps a demand that something not change. Perhaps an insistence that reality be different than it is. Not to judge these attachments, but simply to see them. And in seeing them, perhaps feel what it might be like to hold things just a little more gently. We spend much of our lives trying to manage outcomes. We plan carefully, work hard, arrange circumstances, and attempt to steer events in directions we think they should go. This effort feels necessary, even virtuous. After all, aren't we supposed to take responsibility for our lives? But there's a difference between responding skillfully to what life brings and trying to control what life brings in the first place. One works with reality. The other fights against it. And that fight, no matter how determined or well-intentioned, is often the source of our deepest frustration. The truth is that most of what happens in life is beyond our control. We don't control the weather, the economy, other people's choices, our own thoughts and feelings, aging, illness, or countless other forces that shape our days. We can influence some things within a narrow range, but control? That's mostly an illusion we maintain through constant effort. Zen Buddhism doesn't suggest we become passive or stop trying to do good work in the world. It suggests something more subtle. We can act with full commitment while holding our plans lightly. We can work toward outcomes without demanding that reality cooperate with our vision. We can do what seems right and then meet whatever actually happens with openness rather than resistance. This shift from controlling to responding changes everything. When we're not exhausting ourselves trying to force outcomes, we have more energy to deal with what's actually in front of us. When we're not rigid about how things should unfold, we can adapt when circumstances shift. When we stop fighting with reality, we can finally work with it. In the mountains north of Kyoto, there was a monastery known for its peaceful atmosphere and simple way of life. The abbot of this monastery was a man named Daisetsu, who had led the community for nearly 20 years. Daisetsu ran the monastery with careful attention. He maintained a precise daily schedule. Morning meditation began at dawn, followed by work periods, study time, meals, and evening services, all at specific hours. He organized the monks' responsibilities clearly. He planned the monastery's activities months in advance. Everything had its place, its proper time, its expected form. The monks respected Daisetsu's leadership. The monastery functioned smoothly. Visitors often commented on the orderly beauty of the place, how everything seemed to flow without friction. And Daisetsu took satisfaction in this. He had created something harmonious through his careful management. One autumn morning, just as the monks were settling into their meditation, a stranger appeared at the monastery gate. He was a monk from a temple far to the south, a temple that had just burned to the ground. He had been traveling for weeks, seeking temporary refuge while his community rebuilt. Behind him were 40 more monks from his temple, all exhausted, all needing shelter. The gatekeeper came to find Daisetsu in the meditation hall. He whispered the situation quietly. 40 unexpected guests. No warning. No preparation. Daisetsu paused, considering. The meditation schedule would need to change. The meals he'd planned wouldn't feed so many. The sleeping quarters were already occupied. His careful arrangements would shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. He stood and went to meet the travelers. They stood in the courtyard, travel-worn and uncertain. The leader bowed deeply. "Forgive this intrusion, Master Daisetsu. We would not presume on your hospitality except that our need is great. We've been walking for weeks, sleeping in forests and fields. If you could shelter us even for a few days while we make other arrangements." Daisetsu considered the possibilities. He could direct them to another monastery. He could offer shelter to just a few. He could explain that his community's routine couldn't easily accommodate such an interruption. Each thought arose in turn, each one a way to maintain what he had carefully built. But then he looked at the monks' faces. They were exhausted. Their robes were dirty and torn. Some of them looked ill. They had lost everything and had been walking for weeks. And here he was, worried about his meditation schedule. "Welcome," he heard himself say. "Please, come in. You must be hungry." The next hours unfolded differently than any day in recent memory. The kitchen monks adjusted their preparations for the larger group. Monks rearranged sleeping spaces, making room where they could. The meditation schedule gave way to more immediate needs. Everything Daisetsu had carefully structured shifted into something more fluid. He moved through the monastery, attending to the various needs that arose. A visiting monk needed medicine. The kitchen needed more rice brought from storage. Someone's robe needed mending. Each situation called for a response he hadn't planned for. By evening, Daisetsu sat alone in his room, looking at the schedule he had posted on the wall. None of it had happened today. Nothing had gone according to plan. His carefully structured monastery had become something different, something he hadn't intended. The next morning, he woke before dawn as usual, intending to at least maintain the meditation schedule. But as he walked toward the meditation hall, he heard something unexpected. Voices. Laughter. In the kitchen, the visiting monks and his own monks were working together to prepare breakfast. They were talking, sharing stories about their different monasteries, laughing at jokes. The atmosphere was warm and alive in a way the usually silent kitchen never was. Throughout that day, Daisetsu watched similar scenes. The work periods became collaborative rather than assignments to complete. The visiting monks, grateful for shelter, worked with enthusiasm. They taught his monks songs from their tradition. They shared different ways of preparing tea, different meditation techniques, different perspectives on the teachings. The monastery was louder than usual, less orderly. The schedule remained disrupted, but something else was present that hadn't been there before. A kind of genuine community, spontaneous and real, that the formal structure had somehow been preventing. In the evening, Daisetsu sat with the visiting abbot on the monastery steps, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Thank you again for taking us in," the visitor said. "I know it's disrupted your routine." Daisetsu was quiet for a moment. "I spent 20 years building a particular kind of order here. I thought that order was creating harmony. But I see now it was creating something more like stillness. These past 2 days have been chaotic, and yet there's more genuine life in this place than there's been in years." "Your monks are very disciplined," the visitor observed. "That discipline is clear in everything they do." "Yes, they're disciplined. But I wonder now if I've been using discipline to control something that doesn't need controlling. Life has its own order, its own flow. Maybe I've been fighting with that instead of trusting it." The visiting monks stayed for 2 weeks. In that time, Daisetsu's carefully maintained schedule never fully resumed. But he found he didn't want it to. He began to see his previous approach as a kind of fear dressed up as leadership. He had been trying to prevent anything unexpected from happening, to keep everything predictable and manageable. When the visiting monks finally continued their journey, the monastery didn't return to its former rigid structure. Daisetsu created a lighter framework, enough organization to help things function, but not so much that it prevented natural adaptation. He learned to plan while holding those plans loosely. He discovered that his community was more capable of self-organizing than he had trusted them to be. Years later, monks who had known the monastery in both eras would say it had changed completely. When asked to describe the difference, they would struggle for words. Finally, one old monk put it this way: "Before, we were very organized. Now, we're very alive." Daisetsu's experience reveals something important about the nature of control. His careful organization wasn't wrong or bad. It had created a functioning monastery, but it had also created rigidity. His need to keep everything predictable prevented the natural flow of life from moving through the place. When the unexpected visitors arrived, Daisetsu had a choice. He could try to maintain his control by sending them away or limiting the disruption they caused. Or he could let go of his need for things to go according to plan and meet the situation as it actually was. Notice that letting go didn't mean doing nothing. It meant responding to what was real rather than insisting on what he had planned. The chaos of those first days wasn't easy for him. His whole identity was wrapped up in being the one who kept things organized. Releasing that identity felt like losing himself. But what emerged was something he couldn't have planned or controlled. Genuine community arose naturally when he stopped trying to force a particular form. The monastery became more alive precisely because he stopped trying to manage every aspect of how it functioned. This points to something subtle about control. When we grip something tightly, we often squeeze the life out of it. When we insist things happen in a particular way, we prevent the natural unfolding that might lead somewhere better than we imagined. Control gives us the illusion of safety, but it often costs us vitality. There's another way that control shows up in life, not in managing outer circumstances, but in fighting with what's already happened. In a village known for its pottery, there was a woman named Shizu who had spent her whole life learning her craft. She had studied with her mother and grandmother, both skilled potters. By the time she was 40, Shizu's work was sought after throughout the region. Her bowls and vases were known for their simple beauty and their perfect forms. Shizu worked with incredible care. She would spend days preparing clay, making sure every stone and air bubble was removed. She would throw each piece multiple times until the walls were exactly the thickness she wanted. She would watch the kiln constantly during firing, adjusting the temperature precisely. Nothing was left to chance. Her pottery studio was built next to her house, and her kiln was in a small building behind it. She had designed the kiln herself, learning from the best kiln builders in the province. It was her pride, built to her exact specifications, and it fired her pottery perfectly. One summer, the rainy season came early and lasted longer than usual. For weeks, heavy rain fell almost daily. The ground became saturated. Small streams that usually ran clear became swollen and muddy. One night, Shizu woke to a deep rumbling sound. She ran outside and saw, in the darkness and rain, that the hillside behind her studio had given way. A mudslide was pouring down, heading directly toward her kiln building. She watched, helpless, as the mud engulfed the kiln. The building collapsed under the weight of earth and water. When morning came and the rain finally stopped, her kiln was buried under several feet of mud and debris. It was completely destroyed. Shizu stood looking at the destruction, feeling something collapse inside her. She had spent years building that kiln. Years of planning, construction, adjustment. It had been perfect, and now it was gone. And with it, her ability to fire her pottery. Without the kiln, she couldn't work. Her livelihood was buried under that mud. For days, she tried to figure out how to salvage something. She dug through the mud, hoping to find pieces of the kiln that could be saved. But the structure was completely destroyed. Even if she removed all the mud, the kiln would need to be rebuilt entirely. At first, her mind refused to accept this. She would wake each morning thinking about how to prevent what had already happened. If only she had built the kiln in a different location. If only she had noticed the hillside was unstable. If only the rain hadn't come so early. Her thoughts circled endlessly around these if-onlys, as if thinking about them enough might change what was real. A monk who sometimes visited the village saw Shizu sitting by the destroyed kiln one afternoon. He sat down near her without speaking. They sat together for a long time. "It shouldn't have happened," Shizu finally said. "I was so careful. I planned everything. The kiln was perfect." "Yes," the monk said. "It shouldn't have happened according to your plans. But it did happen according to rain and mud and gravity. I can't accept this. Everything I built is gone." "Not accepting it doesn't change it," the monk said gently. "The kiln is destroyed whether you accept it or not. The question is whether you'll spend your energy fighting with what's already happened, or whether you'll use that energy to respond to what is." Shizu felt anger rise. "So I'm just supposed to be happy about this?" "Not happy, but perhaps not at war with reality. Right now, you're exhausting yourself trying to mentally undo what cannot be undone. That energy could be building something new." Over the following weeks, Shizu noticed what the monk had pointed to. She would catch herself spending hours replaying the disaster, wishing it hadn't happened, imagining how things would be if it hadn't. None of this changed anything. The kiln remained destroyed. But her fighting with that reality was destroying something else, her ability to respond. One morning, she woke with a different thought. The kiln was gone. That was simply true. What now? She went to visit another potter in a neighboring village. This woman had a kiln and agreed to let Shizu use it for a small fee. It meant traveling an hour each way to fire her work, which was inconvenient. The other potter's kiln fired differently than Shizu's had, which meant adjusting her techniques. But as she worked with these new constraints, something unexpected happened. The different firing temperatures created effects in the glazes that she had never achieved before. Some pieces she thought were ruined came out of the kiln with surprising beauty. The inconvenience of traveling forced her to work more efficiently, and she found she was making better decisions about which pieces were worth firing. After several months, Shizu had saved enough to begin rebuilding. But she found herself hesitating. The forced change in her process had revealed possibilities she hadn't known existed. Did she want to rebuild the exact same kiln, or try something different? She decided to build a smaller kiln closer to the village, where other potters could also use it. She incorporated design elements from her old kiln and from the one she'd been borrowing. The new kiln was different and, in some ways, better than what she'd lost. A year after the mudslide, a merchant who had known Shizu's work for years came to purchase pieces for a shop in the capital. He looked at her recent pottery with surprise. "Something has changed in your work," he said. "It's still clearly yours, but there's a quality it didn't have before. More freedom, perhaps. Less perfection, but more life." Shizu understood what he meant. The disaster had forced her to stop gripping her process so tightly. The loss of control had opened possibilities that her need for control had closed off. "I lost something precious," she told the merchant. "And I spent a long time fighting with that loss, trying to undo it in my mind. When I finally stopped fighting and just responded to what was real, I discovered that what seemed like an ending was also a beginning." Years later, younger potters would come to study with Shizu. They admired her skill, but also her attitude. When their own pieces would crack in the kiln or their plans would go wrong, she would tell them about the mudslide, about the destroyed kiln, about the weeks she wasted fighting with what had already happened. "Things will go wrong," she would say. "That's not a failure of planning or skill. That's just how life works. Rain falls. Mud slides. Kilns break. The question isn't how to prevent these things. The question is how quickly you can stop fighting with what's already happened and start working with what is." Shizu's story shows us the exhausting nature of fighting with what's already done. The mudslide had happened. The kiln was destroyed. These were simply facts. But she spent weeks trying to mentally undo those facts, as if her thoughts could reach back in time and prevent what had occurred. This is something we all do. Something goes wrong, and we replay it endlessly. "If only I had done this differently. It shouldn't have happened this way. Why did this happen to me?" These thoughts accomplish nothing except keeping us locked in battle with a reality we cannot change. The monk's question points to the heart of the issue. Are you using your energy to fight what's already happened or to respond to what is? One is utterly futile. The other is how we actually move forward. Notice that accepting what happened didn't mean Shizu liked it or approved of it. It meant she acknowledged the simple truth: the kiln was destroyed. From that acknowledgement, she could begin to respond. As long as she was fighting with the reality of the loss, all her energy went into that futile fight. Once she accepted it, that energy became available for building what came next. The unexpected benefits that came from the disaster, the new techniques, the different kiln design, the more alive quality in her work, these only became visible once she stopped insisting things should have gone according to her plans. Life had brought something she didn't want and couldn't control. But within that unwanted circumstance were possibilities she couldn't have imagined while she was busy demanding reality be different. Both Daisetsu and Shizu show us the same truth from different angles. Control is largely an illusion we maintain through constant effort. When that illusion is shattered by unexpected visitors, by a mudslide, by any of the 1,000 ways life refuses to follow our plans, we have a choice. We can exhaust ourselves trying to reimpose control, or we can learn to respond with flexibility to what's actually happening. This doesn't mean we stop planning or making efforts. Daisetsu still ran his monastery. Shizu still created her pottery with care and skill. But they learned to hold their plans lightly, to work with circumstances rather than demanding circumstances conform to their will. There's a kind of ease that comes with this recognition. When we're not constantly fighting with reality, we have more energy for engaging with it. When we stop trying to control what cannot be controlled, we can focus on responding skillfully to what we can influence. The difference between these two approaches is the difference between exhaustion and vitality, between rigidity and aliveness. As you rest tonight, you might notice where you've been trying to control what cannot be controlled. Perhaps you've been fighting with something that's already happened, trying to mentally undo it. Perhaps you've been demanding that circumstances align with your plans rather than responding to circumstances as they are. Not to judge this impulse toward control, it comes from a natural desire for safety and predictability. But simply to see it and to feel what it might be like to release it, even just a little. To stop fighting and start flowing with what is. We measure constantly how we're doing compared to others, whether we're good enough, if we're ahead or behind, better or worse, succeeding or failing. The mind generates these judgments without pause, creating an endless scorecard of where we stand. This comparing and judging feels natural, even necessary. How else would we know if we're on the right track? How else would we improve? But Zen Buddhism suggests that this constant measuring is one of the main sources of our unease. When we're always evaluating, we're never simply present. When we're always comparing, we're never at peace with what is. The judgments work in both directions. Sometimes we measure ourselves against others and come up short. We see someone more talented, more successful, more at ease, and we feel lacking. Other times, we measure ourselves as superior, but this brings its own subtle anxiety. We must maintain that position, protect it, prove it again and again. Either way, the comparing mind keeps us in a state of tension. We can't rest because there's always another measurement to make, another comparison to check. Are we still ahead? Are we falling behind? The questions never stop, and they prevent us from experiencing life directly. There's also judgment of our own experience. This emotion is acceptable, that one isn't. This thought is good, that one is bad. We divide our inner life into categories of right and wrong, wanted and unwanted. Then we spend energy trying to have only the acceptable experiences and avoid the unacceptable ones. But Zen teaching points to something different. What if we didn't need to constantly measure and evaluate? What if we could experience life without sorting everything into categories of better and worse? This doesn't mean we lose discernment or stop making practical choices. It means we stop exhausting ourselves with constant judgment. In a monastery known for teaching calligraphy, there were 2 young monks who arrived in the same season to begin their training. Their names were Goro and Ren, and from the first day, it was clear they had very different abilities. Goro had a natural gift for brushwork. When he picked up the brush, his hand seemed to know instinctively how to move. His characters had grace and balance from the beginning. The teacher would demonstrate a stroke once, and Goro could reproduce it. Other students would gather to watch him practice, admiring the ease with which he worked. Ren struggled with everything. His hand was stiff. His characters were awkward and unbalanced. He would practice the same stroke hundreds of times and still not achieve the form the teacher had shown. Where Goro's work looked effortless, Ren's showed the strain of intense effort. The teacher, an old monk named Kosho, treated both students with the same attention. He would correct Goro's work when needed and encourage Ren through his difficulties. But the other students began to whisper. Why did the teacher spend so much time with Ren when he clearly had no talent? Why waste instruction on someone who would never become skilled? Goro himself wondered about this. He would finish his practice quickly, his work looking polished and refined. Then he would watch Ren labor over the same exercises for hours, producing characters that still looked clumsy despite all that effort. It seemed obvious that Goro was the better student, the one who deserved more of the teacher's attention. One day, after morning practice, Kosho asked both students to stay behind. He placed 2 scrolls on the table, one from each of them. "Tell me," Kosho said to Goro, "what do you see when you look at your work?" Goro looked at his scroll. The characters were beautiful, well-formed, balanced. "I see good calligraphy," he said simply. "And what did you learn in creating it?" Goro paused. He hadn't really thought about it. The work had come easily, almost automatically. "I learned the correct form of the characters," he said finally. Kosho nodded and turned to Ren. "And you? What do you see in your work?" Ren looked at his scroll with visible disappointment. "I see clumsy characters. I see where my hand moved too quickly here, where I pressed too hard there, where I lost focus and the stroke went crooked." "And what did you learn?" "I learned that when I breathe steadily, my hand is less stiff. I learned that if I watch the ink flow onto the paper, I can feel when I'm forcing the stroke. I learned that my impatience makes the brush wobble, and when I accept that the character takes as long as it takes, the line becomes smoother." Kosho was quiet for a moment, looking at both scrolls. Goro's calligraphy is more beautiful. Anyone can see that. But Ren is learning calligraphy. Goro is simply doing what comes naturally. Goro felt something shift uncomfortably inside him. But isn't the point to create beautiful characters? The point is to understand the way through the brush. Beautiful characters are one result, but not the only one. Ren is developing awareness through struggle. He's learning to feel the connection between his breath, his attention, and his hand. You create beauty without effort, which is a gift. But Ren is learning something deeper. Over the following months, Goro began to watch Ren's practice differently. He noticed how focused Ren became, how completely present to each stroke. When Ren made a mistake, he would pause and examine it carefully, trying to understand exactly what had happened. When a character came out better than before, he would note what had been different in his approach. Goro realized that his own practice had become mechanical. Because the work came easily, he rarely paid deep attention to it. He would complete his exercises while his mind wandered to other things. The beauty of his calligraphy was effortless, but he was learning very little. He began to practice differently, bringing the same careful attention that Ren brought naturally through necessity. He slowed down. He paid attention to his breath, his posture, the feeling of the brush in his hand. His calligraphy became even more refined, but more importantly, he began to understand what Kosho had been teaching. Years passed. Goro's work remained technically superior, his characters more beautiful by conventional standards. But Ren's calligraphy had developed a quality that was harder to name. Each character showed the presence of the person creating it. The strokes had life in them, evidence of full attention and genuine engagement. When students would ask Kosho about the difference between natural talent and dedicated practice, he would sometimes show them scrolls from both monks, not identifying which was which. "This one," he would say, pointing to Goro's work, "shows mastery of technique. And this one, pointing to Ren's, shows mastery of self. Both have value, but only one came through the kind of attention that transforms a person." Goro and Ren became friends over the years, each appreciating what the other brought to the practice. Goro no longer measured his worth by how easily beautiful calligraphy came to him. Ren no longer judged his struggle as evidence of failure. They had both learned that the comparing mind, which creates hierarchies of better and worse, more talented and less talented, misses something essential about the nature of true learning. When they eventually became teachers themselves, they would tell their own students, "Don't compare your practice to anyone else's. Your path is your own. What looks like advantage might be obstacle. What looks like obstacle might be the very thing that opens understanding." The story of Goro and Ren shows how misleading our measurements can be. By every obvious standard, Goro was the better calligrapher. His work was more beautiful. His technique was more polished. If we were judging purely by results, Goro was clearly superior. But that judgment missed what was actually happening. Ren's struggle was forcing him to pay attention in ways that Goro's easy success never required. Ren was developing a quality of presence that would eventually make his work profound, despite its technical imperfection. Goro's gift was real, but it was also allowing him to remain superficial in his practice. This points to something important about comparison. When we measure ourselves against others, we're usually comparing surfaces. We see the results, the external markers of success or failure. But we don't see the inner development, the quality of attention, the depth of engagement. These things are invisible to casual observation, but they're often what matters most. Notice too that the comparing created suffering for both monks. Goro felt superior, which prevented him from learning deeply. Ren felt inferior, which made his genuine progress feel like failure. Both were trapped in a story about better and worse that obscured what was actually true. When Kosho pointed out what was really happening, both monks could begin to see beyond their judgments. Goro could appreciate the depth that struggle can bring. Ren could recognize that his difficulty was teaching him something valuable. The comparing mind fell away, and they could both simply engage with their practice as it was. There's another way that comparison creates suffering. Sometimes we measure ourselves not against distant others, but against people in our immediate world, people whose presence reminds us daily of what we think we lack. In a village known for its fine textiles, there were two weavers whose homes stood side by side. One was named Chiyo, the other Hana. They had grown up together, learned weaving from the same teacher, and had opened their workshops at nearly the same time. For years, they worked alongside each other in friendly companionship. They would share tea in the afternoons, discuss techniques, show each other new patterns they were developing. Each appreciated the other's skill, and there was no tension between them. Then a merchant from the capital came through the village, looking for textiles to sell in the city markets. He visited both workshops, examined their work carefully, and placed a large order with Hana. Her patterns, he said, had a sophistication that would appeal to wealthy customers in the capital. He placed no order with Chiyo. Chiyo told herself she was happy for her friend. And part of her was. But another part began to notice things she hadn't paid attention to before. Hana's workshop was slightly larger than hers. Hana's loom was newer. When customers came through the village, they seemed to spend more time in Hana's shop. She began to compare their work in ways she never had before. When she looked at her own weaving, she saw flaws she hadn't noticed previously. The colors seemed duller next to Hana's vibrant dyes. The patterns seemed simpler, less interesting. She found herself wondering why her work wasn't as good, what she was doing wrong, why the merchant hadn't chosen her. These thoughts, once started, grew stronger. She would lie awake at night thinking about it. She would watch Hana's workshop from her window, noticing when customers entered, wondering what they were buying. She began to feel resentful when Hana mentioned a new commission or showed her a piece she was pleased with. The friendship between them began to change. Chiyo became distant, making excuses to avoid their afternoon tea. When they did talk, Chiyo felt a tightness in her chest, an uncomfortable mixture of envy and shame. She knew her feelings were ungenerous, but she couldn't seem to stop the comparing. Her own work began to suffer. Instead of weaving with the pleasure she had always felt, she found herself constantly evaluating each piece against what she imagined Hana could do. Nothing seemed good enough. She would start a pattern and then abandon it, convinced it wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't beautiful enough, wouldn't be valued enough. One day, an old woman came to the village selling herbs and medicines. She stopped at Chiyo's workshop and asked to see her textiles. Chiyo showed her a few pieces half-heartedly, assuming the woman couldn't afford to buy anything. The old woman examined the work carefully, running her hands over the fabric, holding it up to the light. "This is remarkable," she said quietly. "Look at the evenness of your weave, the way you've blended these colors. There's real skill here." Chiyo felt tears rise unexpectedly. When had anyone last said something appreciative about her work? But even as the woman praised her, Chiyo's mind was already comparing. Hana's work would be even more remarkable to this woman. Hana's skill was greater. "You don't believe me," the old woman observed. "Your neighbor is a more skilled weaver." "I haven't seen your neighbor's work." "I'm looking at yours. But hers is better. Everyone knows that. A merchant from the capital chose her work, not mine." The old woman set down the textile she was holding. "And so you've decided your work has no value?" "It has less value." "That's just true." "Is it? Or is that a story you're telling yourself?" The old woman moved to the window, looking out at the village. "I've lived a long time. I've seen many skilled craftspeople, many talented artists. And I've noticed something. The ones who spend their energy comparing themselves to others rarely develop their full potential. They're too busy measuring to create. But how can I not compare? She's right there, working beside me, creating things more beautiful than what I create. You're not looking at her work. You're looking at your idea of her work. You're imagining it's perfect while yours is flawed. But I'd wager if you looked honestly, you'd see that both of you have strengths and both have weaknesses. You've just decided hers are strengths and yours are weaknesses." The old woman picked up another piece of Chiyo's weaving. This piece has a simplicity that's very appealing. The pattern is clear and restful. Some people want sophistication and complexity. Other people want something that feels calm and honest. Different doesn't mean worse. After the woman left, Chiyo sat in her workshop for a long time. She looked at her textiles, really looked at them, trying to see them without immediately comparing them to Hana's work. It was harder than she expected. Her mind wanted to jump immediately to judgment, to measurement, to the familiar story about whose work was better. But when she managed to just see her own weaving, without comparison, she noticed things she had been overlooking. There was care in her work, steadiness, a kind of quiet beauty that she had stopped appreciating because it wasn't the same as the bold beauty of Hana's pieces. Over the following weeks, Chiyo tried to catch herself when the comparing started. It happened dozens of times a day. She would see Hana's shop and immediately wonder if Hana was getting more customers. She would finish a piece and immediately imagine it next to Hana's work, finding it lacking. Each time, she tried to notice the thought and let it pass, returning her attention to her own work, to what she was actually creating in that moment. It was difficult. The habit of comparing was deeply ingrained. But gradually, something shifted. She began to take pleasure in weaving again, not because she had decided her work was better than Hana's, but because she had stopped asking that question. Her textiles were what they were. Hana's were what they were. Both could be true without one diminishing the other. One afternoon, Chiyo saw Hana working in her garden and felt an impulse she had been avoiding for months. She walked over and asked if Hana would like to share tea the way they used to. Hana's face brightened immediately. "I'd love that. I've missed our talks." They sat together, and Chiyo found that the tightness she'd been feeling around Hana had eased. She could hear about Hana's recent commissions without the sharp edge of envy. She could show Hana her own work without the painful comparing. They were just two weavers again, sharing their craft, each on their own path. Years later, both women would be known throughout the region for their textiles. Hana's work became prized for its complexity and innovation. Chiyo's became valued for its clarity and restraint. Different merchants sought them out for different reasons. Both had full workshops and satisfied customers. When younger weavers would ask Chiyo for advice, she would often tell them, "Learn from others, certainly. Appreciate skill wherever you find it. But don't measure your work against anyone else's. The comparing mind will steal your joy and limit your growth. Make what is yours to make, and let that be enough." Chiyo's experience shows how poisonous comparison can become when we let it take hold. What started as a simple observation that the merchant chose Hana's work over hers grew into a consuming preoccupation. Every interaction with Hana became filtered through the lens of who was better, who had more success, whose work was more valued. The comparing didn't help Chiyo improve. It didn't motivate her to develop her skills. Instead, it paralyzed her creativity and damaged a genuine friendship. She couldn't see her own work clearly anymore because she was always seeing it through the distorting lens of comparison. Notice what happened when the old woman simply looked at Chiyo's weaving without comparing it to anything else. She could see its actual qualities, the skill and care that were genuinely present. Chiyo had lost the ability to see these things because she had made comparison her primary mode of perception. The work of releasing comparison wasn't easy for Chiyo. It required constant attention, catching the habit as it arose, returning again and again to simply seeing what was in front of her. But as that habit loosened its grip, she could return to the direct experience of her craft. She could weave for the pleasure of weaving rather than to prove something or achieve a ranking. Both stories point to the same understanding. The comparing mind creates a false world of hierarchies and measurements that obscures the actual reality of each person's unique path. When we're caught in comparison, we can't see clearly. We can't appreciate what's genuinely present because we're too busy measuring it against something else. This doesn't mean we lose the ability to discern quality or to learn from those who are skilled. It means we stop using comparison as a way to determine our worth or to understand our experience. We can recognize that someone else is skilled without making that recognition into a judgment about our own value. We can appreciate different strengths without creating a ranking of better and worse. When the comparing mind quiets, what remains is simpler. Just this work, this moment, this particular expression of effort and attention. Not better or worse than anyone else's, just what it is. And in that simple seeing, we often find a peace that all our measuring and judging never provided. As you settle into rest tonight, you might notice the comparing mind at work. How many judgments have you made today about yourself or others? How much energy went into measuring and evaluating? Not to judge the judging, but simply to see it. And to feel what it might be like to let some of those measurements go, to rest in the simple truth of what you are without needing to rank it or compare it to anything else. There's a particular kind of suffering that we create entirely ourselves, and we often don't realize we're doing it. Someone hurts us, treats us unfairly, disappoints us deeply. That initial pain is real and natural. But then something else happens. We begin carrying that hurt with us, replaying it, nurturing it, keeping it alive long after the original event has passed. This is what resentment is. It's the decision, often unconscious, to hold on to pain. We tell ourselves we're protecting ourselves, that our anger is justified, that the other person deserves our ongoing disapproval. And all of this may be true in some sense. But the person who suffers most from our resentment is ourselves. The other person goes about their life, often completely unaware of the anger we're carrying toward them. They sleep peacefully while we lie awake replaying old conversations. They enjoy their days while we ruin ours with bitter thoughts. We think our resentment is aimed at them, but actually it's a poison we're drinking ourselves. Zen Buddhism offers a simple but profound question. Who is this resentment hurting? Not in theory, but actually, right now, in this moment? When we answer honestly, we see that we're the ones bearing the weight, feeling the bitterness, losing sleep, carrying the burden. This recognition doesn't come from shoulds. It's not that we should forgive or we should let go, because that's the right thing to do. It's simpler than that. We see clearly that resentment is a fire we're holding in our own hands, and holding it hurts. Letting go of resentment isn't about the other person at all. It's not saying what they did was acceptable. It's not pretending we weren't hurt. It's simply putting down a weight that we no longer want to carry. It's choosing our own peace over the strange satisfaction of staying angry. In a small farming village, there lived two brothers named Kenji and Hiro. They had grown up together, worked the family land together, and lived in houses side by side. For many years, they were close, helping each other with harvests, sharing tools, celebrating festivals together with their families. Their father had left them the family land equally when he died, making clear that both sons should work it together and share the yield. For several years, this arrangement worked well. They would decide together what to plant, work the fields side by side, and divide the harvest fairly. Then came a year of poor rains. The crops suffered, and the harvest was much smaller than usual. When it came time to divide what they'd grown, a disagreement arose. Kenji believed he had worked more hours that year because Hiro had been sick for part of the season. He felt he deserved a slightly larger share to reflect his extra labor. Hiro pointed out that he had contributed more seed from his own stores when they were running short, and his tools had been used for most of the work. Each brother felt his contribution had been greater. The conversation became heated. Words were said that hadn't been meant, or had been meant, but shouldn't have been spoken. Kenji accused Hiro of being lazy. Hiro called Kenji selfish and ungrateful. They divided the harvest roughly in half and parted in anger. That might have been the end of it. An argument between brothers, unpleasant but not unusual. But Kenji couldn't let it go. He replayed the conversation in his mind, thinking of better things he should have said. He watched Hiro's house, noting when his brother seemed to be relaxing instead of working. He collected evidence in his mind of every time Hiro had been inconsiderate or unfair, reaching back years for examples. When neighbors would visit, Kenji would find ways to mention the disagreement, painting himself as the wronged party. He stopped attending village gatherings if Hiro would be there. He instructed his family not to speak to Hiro's family. What had been a single argument grew in Kenji's mind into a fundamental betrayal. Years passed this way. The brothers worked separate sections of the land, never speaking, never acknowledging each other even when they passed on the road. Kenji's resentment had become part of his daily life, as familiar as his morning routine. He thought about the injustice regularly, felt the anger rise, rehearsed what he would say if Hiro ever apologized. But Hiro never apologized. In fact, Hiro seemed to go about his life normally. He worked his fields, spent time with his family, participated in village life. Sometimes Kenji would see him laughing with neighbors, and the sight would make Kenji's anger flare even hotter. How could Hiro be happy when he had wronged his own brother? One spring, a traveling monk named Daiki stopped in the village. He was walking from temple to temple and needed a place to rest for a few days. Kenji offered him shelter, glad for the company since he had isolated himself from much of the village. They sat together in the evenings, and Kenji found himself telling the monk about his brother, about the argument, about the unfairness of it all. The monk listened quietly, not interrupting. "So you see," Kenji concluded, "I have good reason to be angry. What he did was wrong." "Perhaps it was," the monk said. "But tell me, how is your life these days?" "What do you mean? Are you happy? Do you sleep well? Do you enjoy your work?" Kenji paused. Now that he thought about it, he wasn't happy. He often lay awake at night, thinking about Hiro. His work in the fields felt lonely and bitter. He had distanced himself from friends and neighbors in his anger. Even time with his own family was colored by his resentment. "Not particularly," he admitted. "And your brother? How does he seem?" "He seems fine," Kenji said with some bitterness. "That's what makes it worse. He wronged me and he's fine." The monk was quiet for a moment. "So he wronged you once, several years ago. And since then, you've been punishing yourself daily by carrying anger toward him. Does that seem wise?" "I'm not punishing myself. I'm holding him accountable." "Are you? Does he feel held accountable? Or does he simply go about his life while you sit here, alone, angry, unable to sleep, separated from your community?" Kenji wanted to argue, but he couldn't find the words. What the monk said was uncomfortably true. His resentment toward Hiro wasn't affecting Hiro at all. It was only affecting himself. "But I can't just forget what he did." "I'm not suggesting you forget. I'm asking whether you want to continue carrying this weight. Not because Hiro deserves your forgiveness, but because you deserve peace." Over the next few days, Kenji thought about this. He began to notice how often his mind turned to thoughts of Hiro, to the old argument, to his list of grievances. He saw how much energy he was spending on this resentment. Energy that could have gone into enjoying his work, his family, his life. He realized something uncomfortable. The argument with Hiro had lasted perhaps an hour, but he had been having that argument in his mind every day for years. Hiro had hurt him once. Kenji had been hurting himself thousands of times since, replaying it endlessly. One morning, Kenji woke and made a decision. He didn't want to carry this anymore. Not because Hiro deserved forgiveness, but because he himself deserved freedom from this constant anger. He walked to Hiro's house. His brother saw him coming and stood in the doorway, uncertain. "I came to say I'm done with this," Kenji said. "The argument we had, the anger between us, I'm done carrying it." Hiro was quiet for a moment. "I've wanted to speak to you many times over the years. I was wrong in some of what I said that day. I was angry and spoke harshly." "I was wrong too," Kenji admitted. "But more than that, I was wrong to hold on to it for so long. I've wasted years on this." They didn't fall into each other's arms like brothers in a story. The reunion was quiet and somewhat awkward. Years of separation couldn't be undone in a moment. But something had changed. The weight Kenji had been carrying was gone. In the weeks that followed, Kenji noticed the difference. He slept better. His work felt lighter. He rejoined village gatherings. He smiled more easily. His family commented that he seemed more present, more himself. His relationship with Hiro slowly rebuilt over time. It never went back to exactly what it had been before the argument, but it became something real again. They would help each other during busy seasons. They would share a meal occasionally. They were brothers again, imperfectly but genuinely. Years later, when Kenji was an old man, younger villagers would sometimes ask him for advice about conflicts and grudges. He would tell them about the years he spent angry at his brother. "I thought I was punishing him," he would say. "But I was only punishing myself. The day I let go of that resentment was the day I got my life back. Not because Hiro deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved peace." Kenji's story shows something we all do in smaller or larger ways. Someone hurts us, and instead of feeling the hurt and letting it pass, we hold on to it. We keep the wound fresh by replaying it, by building a case against the other person, by staying angry year after year. The original hurt was real. Hiro had said harsh things. The argument was genuinely painful. But Kenji then took that single painful event and turned it into years of ongoing suffering. Not because he had to, but because he didn't realize he had a choice. Notice that letting go wasn't about deciding that Hiro was right or that the argument didn't matter. It was about recognizing that the resentment was hurting Kenji more than anyone else. The monk's question was simple and direct. Is this making your life better or worse? When Kenji looked honestly at that question, the answer was clear. The resentment was making him lonely, bitter, unable to sleep, cut off from his community. Hiro was living his life normally while Kenji suffered. The punishment wasn't landing where Kenji thought it was. This is what resentment does. It feels like we're holding the other person accountable, maintaining our dignity, refusing to let them off the hook. But actually, we're just carrying a heavy stone everywhere we go, and the other person usually doesn't even notice. Sometimes the hurt goes deeper than an argument between brothers. Sometimes the injury is serious, the betrayal real, the damage lasting. But even then, the question remains, who suffers from carrying this resentment? In a town near the coast, there was a merchant named Fumio who owned a small trading business. He had built it carefully over many years, developing relationships with suppliers and customers, earning a reputation for fair dealing and quality goods. Fumio had a business partner, a man named Takeshi, who handled the accounting and arrangements while Fumio managed relationships and travel. They had worked together for a decade, and Fumio considered Takeshi a friend as well as a partner. One season, Fumio took a long trip to establish new trade connections in the north. He was gone for several months. When he returned, he discovered that Takeshi had been stealing from the business. Not small amounts, but substantial sums over a long period. Takeshi had been keeping a separate set of books, showing Fumio records that made it look like the business was barely profitable while actually pocketing a large portion of the earnings. When confronted, Takeshi showed no remorse. He claimed he deserved the extra money, that he did more work than Fumio realized, that Fumio was gone too often to understand the business anymore. He left the partnership and moved to another town, taking with him money that legally belonged to both of them. Fumio was devastated. He had trusted Takeshi completely. The betrayal felt personal and profound. And the financial loss was serious, threatening the business he had worked so hard to build. In the months that followed, Fumio thought about Takeshi constantly. He would lie awake at night, imagining confrontations, planning revenge, wishing for Takeshi to suffer as he was suffering. He told the story to anyone who would listen, describing Takeshi's betrayal in bitter detail. He sent letters to merchants in the town where Takeshi had moved, warning them about his former partner. The anger consumed him. His business suffered because he couldn't focus on it properly. He was short-tempered with his employees, suspicious of everyone, unable to trust. His health began to decline. He stopped eating well, stopped sleeping properly. His wife watched with concern as he grew thinner and more haggard. One evening, an old friend came to visit. They sat together in silence for a while, and then the friend said gently, "Takeshi stole your money. Are you going to let him steal your life as well?" Fumio looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Look at yourself. You're not eating. You're not sleeping. Your business is failing because you can't pay attention to it. You've pushed away people who care about you. Takeshi took your money and left. But you're the one who's still here, still suffering, still letting him damage you day after day. But what he did was terrible. He deserves my anger." "Maybe he does. But does your anger hurt him? He's in another town, starting over, probably not thinking about you at all. Meanwhile, you're here destroying yourself over what he did. So I should just forget about it? Pretend it didn't happen? No. Remember it clearly. Learn from it. Take whatever practical steps you need to protect yourself and your business. But stop drinking the poison of resentment. It's killing you, not him." Fumio sat with this for a long time. Part of him wanted to reject the advice. His anger felt justified, even righteous. Takeshi had wronged him terribly. Surely he had a right to his anger. But another part of him recognized the truth in his friend's words. He looked at what his life had become since the betrayal. He had been robbed once by Takeshi. But he had been robbing himself every day since, stealing his own peace, his own health, his own capacity to live. He thought about his business, which he had loved before all this happened. He thought about his wife, whom he had been neglecting. He thought about the future he could build if he weren't spending all his energy looking backward at what had been taken. The decision to let go of the resentment wasn't a single moment, but a process. Each time thoughts of Takeshi would arise, bringing the familiar anger with them, Fumio would notice and choose differently. He wouldn't feed those thoughts with attention. He wouldn't rehearse the story of betrayal one more time. It was difficult. The habit of anger was strong, and the hurt was real. But gradually, the resentment began to loosen its grip. Fumio found he could go hours without thinking about Takeshi, then days. The anger still arose sometimes, but it didn't consume him the way it had. He began to rebuild. He restructured his business, implementing new safeguards. He hired a new partner, though he was more careful this time about trust. He apologized to his wife for his absence and began to reconnect with her. He started eating properly again, sleeping better. His health improved. A year after the betrayal, Fumio's business was doing better than it had in years. He had learned from what happened, had become wiser about trust and oversight, had created systems that protected the business better. The loss had taught him things that made him a better merchant. One day, he heard that Takeshi's new ventures had failed and that he was struggling financially. Fumio felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was brief and hollow. He realized he didn't really care what happened to Takeshi anymore. That chapter was closed. When younger merchants would come to him for advice, he would sometimes tell them about the betrayal and what he learned from it. But the focus was never on Takeshi or revenge or the injustice of it. The focus was on what he had discovered about the cost of resentment. Someone will wrong you in business, he would say. That's almost inevitable. The question is whether you'll let that wrong continue to damage you long after the other person has moved on. The betrayal was Takeshi's choice, but the suffering I went through afterward was my choice. I could have chosen differently. Fumio's hurt was deeper and more justified than Kenji's. Takeshi's betrayal was serious, the damage real. No one would have blamed Fumio for being angry. The anger was natural and understandable. But natural and understandable doesn't mean helpful. The anger wasn't bringing Fumio's money back. It wasn't punishing Takeshi. It wasn't protecting Fumio from future betrayals. It was simply making Fumio's life smaller, darker, more painful. The friend's question cut to the heart of it. Are you going to let him steal your life as well? Takeshi had already taken money from Fumio. By holding on to resentment, Fumio was letting Takeshi continue to take from him. His peace, his health, his relationships, his capacity to move forward, all of these were being sacrificed to anger that served no purpose. Letting go wasn't about pretending the betrayal was acceptable or that Takeshi was a good person. Fumio learned from what happened. He changed his practices. He became wiser. But he stopped carrying the emotional weight of the betrayal as a daily burden. Both Kenji and Fumio discovered the same truth. Resentment is a fire we hold in our own hands. We think we're directing it at someone else, but we're the ones getting burned. The other person, whether they wronged us accidentally or deliberately, whether the hurt was small or large, is usually off living their life. We're the ones who remain stuck, replaying old injuries, unable to move forward. The freedom that comes from releasing resentment isn't about the other person. It's not forgiveness in the sense of saying what they did was fine. It's simpler and more self-interested than that. It's recognizing that holding this anger is hurting us and choosing to put it down. This doesn't happen all at once. The habit of resentment is often deep and well practiced. But each time we notice the resentful thought arising and choose not to feed it, we loosen its grip a little. Each time we redirect our attention from old hurts to present possibility, we reclaim a bit of our life. The person who wronged us may never apologize, may never suffer consequences, may never even realize the impact of their actions. That's not within our control. But whether we continue to suffer over what they did, that's entirely up to us. As you rest tonight, you might notice if you're carrying resentment toward anyone. Not to judge yourself for it, but simply to see it. And to ask yourself honestly, is carrying this making my life better? Is this weight worth bearing? Not what the other person deserves, but what you deserve. Do you deserve peace, or do you deserve to keep suffering over something that's already done? The answer, when we look clearly, is almost always obvious. And sometimes that clarity is the first step toward finally putting down what we never needed to carry in the first place. Most of us spend very little time in the present moment. We're here physically, but our attention is elsewhere. We're replaying yesterday's conversation, planning tomorrow's tasks, worrying about next week, regretting last year. We're anywhere but here, anytime but now. This wouldn't matter if the past and future were places we could actually inhabit. But they're not. The past is gone, no longer existing except as memories and thoughts. The future hasn't arrived yet and exists only as imagination and projection. The present moment, right now, is the only place we actually exist. And yet it's the place we visit least often. Zen Buddhism notices something simple but profound. All our worry happens in thoughts about the future. All our regret happens in thoughts about the past. But the present moment, the actual here and now, is almost always workable. Right now, in this moment, without adding thoughts about what was or what will be, things are usually okay. This doesn't mean the present moment is always pleasant. Sometimes it contains difficulty, discomfort, challenge. But even difficult present moments are different from the suffering we create by leaving the present to dwell in past regrets or future anxieties. The present moment has a quality of simplicity. It's just what it is, without the layers of story we add. When we're truly present, the mind becomes quieter. Not because we're trying to quiet it, but because thinking mostly involves past and future. When attention is fully here, fully now, there's less for the mind to do. We can simply experience what's actually happening rather than thinking about it, judging it, comparing it to other moments. This presence isn't complicated. It's not a special state that requires years of training. It's available right now. It's the natural result of bringing attention to what's actually here rather than to our thoughts about what was or will be. In a village surrounded by rice fields, there was a farmer named Jiro who had worked the same land for most of his life. He knew every part of his fields, every variation in the soil, every place where water collected after rain. His father and grandfather had worked this land before him, and he expected his son would work it after he was gone. Jiro was good at his work. He understood the rhythms of planting and harvest, knew when to irrigate and when to let the fields rest. His yields were dependable, his rice of good quality. But despite his skill and success, Jiro rarely felt at peace. During planting season, he worried about the coming harvest. Would there be enough rain? Too much? Would the autumn storms come early? He would plant the young rice seedlings while thinking ahead months to the harvest, calculating yields, planning what he would do if the weather didn't cooperate. During the growing season, he worried about pests, disease, the condition of the plants. He would walk through his fields examining the rice, but he wasn't really seeing what was in front of him. He was imagining disaster scenarios, planning contingencies, projecting into a future that hadn't happened yet. When harvest season finally came, he barely noticed it. He was already thinking about next year's planting, about repairs the storage building needed, about replacing tools that were wearing out. The harvest that he had worried about for months would come and go while his mind was somewhere else. One year, an old monk named Soen came to stay in a small temple near Jiro's village. The monk was traveling slowly through the region, stopping to rest for weeks at a time. He would often walk through the countryside, and sometimes his path took him past Jiro's fields. One spring morning, Soen stopped at the edge of a field where Jiro was planting. The farmer was bent over, placing seedlings in neat rows, but his face was tight with tension. He worked quickly, mechanically, his mind clearly somewhere else. "Beautiful morning," Soen said. Jiro looked up, surprised. "Yes, I suppose so." "You suppose so? You're not certain?" Jiro straightened, wiping his forehead. "I don't have time to notice the morning. I have to finish planting this section before the weather changes." "I see. And when you finish planting, what then?" "Then I have to repair the irrigation channels before the water comes." "And after that?" "Then monitor the fields for pests, maintain the terraces, prepare for harvest." "And after harvest?" "Prepare for next year's planting." Soen nodded slowly. "So you're always preparing for the next thing, thinking ahead to what needs doing. When do you actually do what you're doing?" Jiro didn't understand the question. "I am doing it. I'm planting right now." "Are you?" "Your hands are planting, but where is your mind?" Jiro realized with some discomfort that while his hands had been placing seedlings, his mind had been calculating whether he'd have enough rice seed for the entire field, worrying about a section where water tended to pool, planning tomorrow's work. He hadn't actually been present to the planting at all. "I have a lot to think about," he said defensively. "Farming isn't simple." "No, it isn't," Soen agreed. "But tell me, does thinking about the harvest while you plant make the planting go better?" "I suppose not. But I need to plan ahead. There's a difference between planning and worry, between intelligent preparation and constant mental rehearsal of things that haven't happened yet." Over the next few weeks, Soen would sometimes appear at the edge of Jiro's fields. He never stayed long or said much, but his presence seemed to remind Jiro to notice where his mind was. And when Jiro noticed, he was almost always somewhere other than the present moment. One afternoon, while Jiro was checking the water levels in his fields, Soen asked him, "What are you doing right now?" "Checking the water," Jiro replied. "And how does the water look?" Jiro realized he didn't know. He had been walking along the irrigation channels, but he hadn't really been looking at the water. He had been thinking about whether it would rain later in the week, calculating how many days until he'd need to irrigate again, worrying about a section of channel that needed repair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I wasn't really looking." "Perhaps look now," Soen suggested. Jiro stopped and actually looked at the water moving through the channel. He saw how it caught the afternoon light, how it made a gentle sound as it flowed, how small plants grew along its edges. These were things he passed every day but never truly saw. When you're checking water but thinking about next week's rain, Soen said, you're missing both. You're not really checking the water, and you can't actually know about next week's rain. You're simply creating anxiety. This conversation stayed with Jiro. He began to notice how rarely he was actually present to what he was doing. While working, his mind was planning. While eating, his mind was reviewing the day's work. While trying to sleep, his mind was listing tomorrow's tasks. He was never quite where he was. He started practicing something simple. When he noticed his mind had wandered to past or future, he would bring attention back to what he was actually doing. Not as a rigid discipline, but gently, like reminding himself where he was. When planting, just plant. When walking, just walk. When eating, just eat. It was harder than he expected. His mind was so accustomed to projecting ahead, planning, worrying. Bringing it back to the present felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable. The present moment seemed too simple, too quiet. But over time, something shifted. He began to notice things he had been missing for years. The way morning light fell on his fields. The feeling of soil in his hands. The satisfaction of completing a row of planting. These simple experiences had been happening all along, but he had been too busy thinking to notice them. His work began to feel different. Not easier in terms of physical effort, but lighter somehow. When he was planting, he was just planting, not carrying the weight of 1,000 future concerns. When a problem arose, he dealt with it without layering on anxiety about all the other problems that might arise later. One summer evening, Soen came to sit with Jiro at the edge of the fields. The rice was tall and green, swaying gently in the wind. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change as the sun set. "I've been farming these fields my whole life," Jiro said quietly. "But I don't think I really saw them until recently. I was always somewhere else in my mind, always focused on what came next. And now? Now I'm here more often. Not always, but more. And I've realized that most of what I was worrying about never happened. I spent years anxious about possible disasters that didn't come. Even the real problems that did arise, I handled them when they came. The worry beforehand didn't help at all. The future will come in its own time," Soen said. "The past is already gone. But this moment, right now, this is real. The wind on your face is real. The sight of your fields is real. This is where your life is actually happening." Jiro continued farming for many more years. He still planned appropriately, still prepared for seasons ahead. But he stopped living in constant projection and anxiety. When he planted, he was present to the planting. When he harvested, he was present to the harvest. And in that presence, he found a peace that all his planning and worrying had never provided. When younger farmers would ask him for advice, he would tell them about the years he spent missing his own life while worrying about the future. "Learn to be where you are," he would say. "The work doesn't get easier, but you'll actually be present for your life instead of always thinking about what comes next." Jiro's experience shows something many of us do without realizing it. We're physically present but mentally absent, our attention scattered across time, replaying the past or rehearsing the future. We miss the actual texture of our lives because we're too busy thinking about life instead of experiencing it. Notice that when Soen asked Jiro what he was doing, Jiro could name the activity, but he wasn't actually experiencing it. His hands were planting while his mind was months ahead at harvest. His body was checking water while his mind was days ahead worrying about rain. He was like a person watching a movie while thinking about a different movie entirely. The shift for Jiro wasn't about stopping all planning or preparation. He still needed to think ahead appropriately. But he discovered the difference between useful planning and constant anxious projection. One helps us work skillfully. The other just creates suffering without benefit. When Jiro learned to be more present, he didn't become less competent as a farmer. If anything, he became more attentive because he was actually seeing what was in front of him rather than being lost in thoughts. The present moment gave him better information than his anxious projections ever had. What he found in the present wasn't always pleasant. Some days the work was tiring, some seasons brought real challenges. But even difficult present moments had a simplicity that the constant worry lacked. A tired body is just a tired body. A pest problem is just a pest problem. These things are workable. It's the layers of anxious thinking we add that make them feel overwhelming. The past creates its own kind of absence. We can be physically here, but mentally living in what was, replaying old scenes, wishing things had been different, carrying what's already gone as if it's still happening. In a town known for its schools and scholars, there was a teacher named Ayako who had dedicated her life to education. She had taught for 20 years, first in a small village school and then at a respected academy in the larger town. She loved teaching, loved seeing students discover new ideas, loved the feeling of helping young people find their way. Then something happened that changed everything. The academy where she taught had a new director, a man with different ideas about education. He wanted to modernize the curriculum, bring in younger teachers with new methods. After a difficult year of increasing tension, Ayako was told that her position was being eliminated. The dismissal was presented as a budget issue, but Ayako knew the real reason. The new director wanted different approaches than hers. She felt pushed out, undervalued, dismissed after years of dedication. She was 50 years old with no clear path forward. She found a position at a smaller school, one that paid less and had fewer resources. The work was adequate, but not fulfilling in the way her old position had been. And she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Every day, she would replay scenes from her last year at the academy. The meeting where the director had criticized her teaching methods. The moment she was told her position was ending. The awkward farewell gathering where she had tried to maintain dignity while feeling humiliated. These scenes played in her mind like a performance she couldn't stop watching. She would imagine different responses she could have made, more forceful defenses, ways she could have fought harder or handled things differently. In her mind, she revised history constantly, creating versions where things went differently, where she was vindicated, where the director realized his mistake. Her thoughts about the past consumed her. While teaching her current students, she would find herself thinking about her old academy. While preparing lessons, she would compare this small school unfavorably to where she used to work. While trying to sleep, she would replay old conversations, old conflicts, old disappointments. She grew bitter. Her teaching began to suffer because she wasn't fully present to it. Students noticed that she seemed distracted, that her attention was elsewhere. The joy she had once brought to her work was gone, replaced by a heaviness that colored everything. One afternoon, a student stayed after class. She was a quiet girl who rarely spoke up, but she had been watching Ayako with concern. "Teacher," the girl said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course." "You seem sad, like you don't want to be here. Do you not like teaching anymore?" The question struck Ayako deeply. She had been so lost in thoughts about her old academy that she hadn't realized how her students were experiencing her. This girl, this real student in front of her right now, was being taught by someone whose heart was somewhere else. "I'm sorry," Ayako said. "You're right. I've been distracted. But not because of you or this school. Because of something that happened before. Can you fix it?" "No. It's already done. In the past." The girl looked confused. "Then why do you keep thinking about it?" It was such a simple question, asked with such honest curiosity, that Ayako had no ready answer. Why was she thinking constantly about something that was over, done, unchangeable? What was she gaining from these endless mental replays? That evening, Ayako sat in her small apartment and tried to see her situation clearly. She had been wronged, yes. The dismissal had been unfair, but it was a year in the past. The director was at the academy, likely not thinking about her at all. The job was gone. None of her mental replaying changed any of this. Meanwhile, she had students here, now, who deserved a teacher who was actually present. She had work in front of her that could be meaningful if she let it be. She had a life happening right now that she was missing because she was living in the past. She thought about the student's question, "Can you fix it?" The answer was no. The past was unchangeable. No amount of mental revision would alter what had happened. She was spending her present energy trying to change something that no longer existed. Over the following weeks, Ayako practiced noticing when her mind went to the past. It happened often, sometimes dozens of times in a single day. Each time, she would acknowledge the thought and bring her attention back to the present. Back to the student in front of her. Back to the lesson she was teaching. Back to the moment she was actually in. It was surprisingly difficult. The past felt important somehow, like if she stopped replaying it, she would be letting the director off the hook or betraying herself. But gradually, she realized that the only person these thoughts were hurting was herself. The director wasn't affected by her mental replays. The academy went on without her. She was the only one suffering from this constant backward looking. As she released her grip on the past, something unexpected happened. She began to see her current school differently. It was smaller, yes, with fewer resources. But the students were genuine and engaged. She had more freedom to teach as she wanted. The smaller classes meant more personal connection. Her teaching came alive again. Students noticed the change. She was present with them, actually listening, actually seeing them. The joy that had left her work began to return, not because circumstances had changed, but because she had stopped trying to live in the past. Years later, Ayako would look back on the dismissal from the academy as difficult, but ultimately freeing. It had forced her into a change she wouldn't have chosen, but that change had brought unexpected gifts. But more importantly, it had taught her something about how she related to her own past. When younger teachers would come to her with their own disappointments and setbacks, she would listen with understanding. And sometimes she would tell them about the year she spent mentally living in the past while her present life happened without her. The past is a place you can visit in memory, she would say, but you can't live there. Every moment you spend trying to live in what was, you're missing what is. And what is the only place your life actually happens. Ayako's dwelling in the past shows another way we leave the present moment. While Jiro was lost in the future, Ayako was lost in the past. Both were absent from their actual lives, their attention somewhere other than where they were. The past Ayako kept replaying wasn't helping her. It wasn't changing what had happened. It wasn't making her feel better. It was just keeping her locked in a painful story, unable to move forward. She mistook constant mental replay for some kind of important processing, but actually it was just suffering on repeat. The student's simple question cut through all of Ayako's complex thinking. Can you fix it? No. Then why keep dwelling on it? There was no good answer except that it had become a habit, a groove her mind fell into automatically. When Ayako began to pull her attention back to the present, she didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. The dismissal was real, the hurt was real. But she stopped trying to live in a time that no longer existed. She stopped letting something that was over continue to damage her present life. What she found in the present wasn't perfect. Her new job was less prestigious, paid less, offered less. But it was real, it was happening now, and when she was actually present to it, it had its own value. The students in front of her were real students who deserved a real teacher, not someone whose attention was constantly elsewhere. Both Jiro and Ayako discovered the same truth from different directions. The present moment is where life actually happens. The past is memory. The future is imagination. Only now is real. And when we're actually here, fully present to what is, we often find that this moment, exactly as it is workable. Not always pleasant, not always easy, but workable. And certainly better than the suffering we create by constantly leaving it to dwell in times that don't exist. There's a simplicity to the present moment that the past and future never have. The present just is what it is. A tired body, an unfinished task, a conversation happening, a meal being eaten, a breath being taken. Simple, direct, immediate. No stories needed, no elaborate thinking required. When we're actually present, the mind becomes quieter naturally. Not because we're suppressing thoughts, but because much of our thinking involves past and future. When attention is here, now, there's less for the mind to do. We can simply experience what's happening without needing to think so much about it. This doesn't mean we never remember the past or plan for the future. We do, when it's useful. But we do it from a foundation of presence rather than losing ourselves in time. We remember something when it's relevant, plan something when it's needed, and then return to now. The present moment becomes home, and past and future become places we visit briefly rather than where we live. As you settle into rest tonight, notice where your attention goes. Does it drift to tomorrow's concerns? Does it replay today's events? Does it wander to old memories or future worries? Each time you notice it has left the present, you can gently bring it back. Just this moment, just this breath, just this simple reality of being here, now, exactly as you are. The peace that's available in the present moment isn't something you have to create or achieve. It's what's here when you stop leaving. When the mind isn't projecting into imagined futures or replaying unchangeable pasts, there's a natural settling. Not blank emptiness, but simple presence. Just this. Just now. just here. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes not from working hard, but from constantly trying to become something other than what we are. We strive to be better, more accomplished, more peaceful, more enlightened. We're always reaching for the next level, the next achievement, the next version of ourselves that will finally be enough. This striving feels virtuous. We call it self-improvement, growth, development. We believe that if we just try hard enough, work consistently enough, push ourselves far enough, we'll arrive at some state where we can finally rest, where we'll be complete, where we'll be acceptable. But Zen Buddhism notices something about this endless striving. It never actually leads to rest. Each goal achieved simply reveals another goal beyond it. Each level reached shows another level above. The finish line keeps moving because we keep moving it. We've created a race that has no end, and we're exhausting ourselves running it. There's a different way, though it feels counterintuitive to people accustomed to constant effort. What if you're already complete? Not perfect, not finished developing, but fundamentally whole right now. What if peace isn't something you achieve through striving, but something you discover when the striving stops? This doesn't mean we become passive or stop growing naturally. It means we stop the exhausting work of constantly trying to be different than we are. We can act, learn, develop, but from a foundation of already being enough rather than from a desperate sense of not being enough yet. The people in tonight's stories all discovered that what they were seeking so hard was closer than they imagined. Not far away at the end of some long path of effort, but here, now, already present when they stopped running away from it. In a monastery in the mountains, there was a monk named Takuan who had been practicing meditation for 12 years. He was known among the other monks for his dedication. He would sit longer than anyone else, often meditating for hours beyond the scheduled practice times. He followed every rule precisely. He studied the teachings diligently. He was determined to achieve enlightenment. Each morning, Takuan would rise before the other monks and sit in meditation, trying to quiet his mind, trying to reach some state of perfect clarity. Each evening, he would sit long after the others had gone to sleep, continuing his practice. During work periods, he would recite sutras silently to himself. During meals, he would eat mindfully, paying careful attention to each bite. From the outside, Takuan seemed like the ideal practitioner. But inside, he was exhausted. The constant effort to be mindful, to be present, to be enlightened was wearing him down. He felt like he was getting nowhere despite all his work. His mind was no quieter than when he started. His clarity was no greater. He still felt frustrated, still got distracted, still experienced all the ordinary human reactions he was trying to overcome. The abbot of the monastery, an old monk named Hakuin, watched Takuan's intense practice with concern. One day, he called Takuan to his room. "Tell me," Hakuin said, "what are you seeking?" "Enlightenment, Master. I'm trying to awaken, to see clearly, to be free from suffering." "And how is that going?" Takuan felt the weight of his 12 years of effort. "I don't know. I practice constantly, but I feel no closer than when I began. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe I need to sit longer, practice more intensely." Hakuin was quiet for a moment. "Let me tell you a story. There was once a man who wanted to see the sunset. He heard it was beautiful beyond description, that seeing it would change his life. So he began traveling west, walking toward where the sun sets. He walked for days, weeks, months, always moving west, always seeking the sunset. But no matter how far he traveled, the sunset remained ahead of him, always at the horizon, never reached. What happened to him? Takuan asked. He died exhausted, still walking west, never understanding that the sunset comes to you. You don't go to it. You simply stop and watch it arrive. Takuan sat with this story, feeling something uncomfortable stir inside him. Are you saying I should stop practicing? I'm saying that enlightenment isn't a destination you reach through effort. It's not far away, waiting for you to finally become worthy of it. What you're seeking is here, now. But you're too busy seeking to notice it. But if I don't strive, how will I improve? How will I overcome my obstacles? Your striving has become your main obstacle. You're so busy trying to be peaceful that you can't be peaceful. So busy trying to be present that you miss the present moment. So busy trying to achieve enlightenment that you overlook the awareness that's already here. Hakuin asked Takuan to try something different for the next month. Instead of his intense practice schedule, he should practice less. Sit for the scheduled periods with the other monks, but not the extra hours. Work during work time without reciting sutras. Eat meals without making it into a meditation exercise. Just be ordinary. This instruction made Takuan anxious. If he stopped his intense practice, wouldn't he fall behind? Wouldn't all his years of effort be wasted? But he trusted his teacher, so he agreed to try. The first few days felt wrong. During the times he usually sat in extra meditation, he found himself restless, not knowing what to do. He felt guilty for not striving, as if he were betraying his commitment. But Hakuin had been clear, just be ordinary for a month. After about a week, something began to shift. The constant tension that had been driving him started to ease. He noticed he was sleeping better. During scheduled meditation, he found his mind actually settling more easily than when he had been forcing it for hours. One afternoon, Takuan was sweeping the courtyard, just sweeping, not trying to make it into spiritual practice or use it as an opportunity for mindfulness training. The broom moved across the stones. The sound of bristles on rock. The autumn leaves gathering in small piles. Sunlight slanting through the trees. In that simple moment, something became clear. The awareness that was noticing the sweeping, the sounds, the light, this awareness was already peaceful. It wasn't something he needed to achieve. It was already here, already clear, already free. He had been striving so hard to attain something he already had. He stopped sweeping and stood still, the broom in his hands. The noticing continued. Breath moving. Sounds present. The simple fact of being aware. This had been here all along, through all his years of intense practice. He just hadn't been able to see it because he was too busy trying to get somewhere else. That evening, Takuan went to see Hakuin. I think I understand, he said quietly. I've been like that man walking west, trying to reach something that can only come when I stop walking. Yes. And the awareness I was seeking, it's already here. It's what's noticing my thoughts, my striving, my exhaustion. It was never absent. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy looking for it. Hakuin smiled. You've been carrying a heavy load for 12 years. How does it feel to put it down? Light. And somehow sad too. All that effort, all that struggle, and what I needed was to stop struggling. Not wasted, Hakuin said gently. The struggling brought you to the point where you could finally stop. Sometimes we need to try very hard before we can understand that trying isn't the answer. Takuan continued to practice, but differently. He sat in meditation, but without the grim determination to achieve something. He worked, but without constantly monitoring whether he was being mindful enough. He lived more simply, more ordinarily. And in that ordinariness, he found the peace he had been seeking through extraordinary effort. Years later, when students would come to him pushing themselves hard, exhausting themselves with intense practice, he would tell them about his 12 years of striving. I don't regret those years, he would say. But I learned that peace isn't achieved through effort. It's what remains when unnecessary effort stops. You can't force yourself into freedom. You can only stop forcing and discover the freedom that's already here. Takuan's story shows how striving can become its own obstacle. His dedication wasn't wrong, but he had turned practice into a project, enlightenment into a goal that always stayed just out of reach. The harder he tried to be peaceful, the more tension he created. The more intensely he sought clarity, the more clouded his vision became. The shift came when he stopped trying so hard and simply allowed himself to be ordinary. Not giving up, but releasing the desperate grasping quality that had infected his practice. In that release, he could finally see what had been present all along. This points to something paradoxical about striving. Often, we can't find what we're seeking because the seeking itself is what obscures it. We're looking so hard, trying so intensely, that we miss the simple reality right in front of us. We're like someone searching frantically for their glasses while wearing them. The awareness Takuan discovered wasn't something he created through his practice. It was already here, noticing everything, including his striving and frustration. His practice didn't produce this awareness. It only helped him recognize what was already present. Sometimes the striving shows up not in spiritual practice, but in ordinary life, in the constant drive to improve ourselves, to become better versions of who we are. In a coastal town known for its pottery, there lived a woman named Ume who made simple tea bowls and cups. She had learned the craft from her mother and had been working with clay for 20 years. Her pieces were functional and honest, appreciated by local people who used them daily. But Ume wasn't satisfied. She would visit other potters whose work was more refined, more artistic. She would see their elegant forms and sophisticated glazes and feel inadequate. She began taking every class available, learning new techniques, studying different traditions. She would work late into the night trying to improve her skills. She started criticizing her own work harshly. Each piece she made was compared to an ideal in her mind, an ideal that kept changing, always staying just beyond her reach. Nothing she created seemed good enough. She would finish a bowl and immediately see its flaws, its lack of sophistication, all the ways it fell short. Her students noticed the change in her. She had always been encouraging, patient with their learning process. Now she was critical, pointing out flaws, pushing them to be better. The joy that had characterized her teaching was replaced with a kind of driven intensity. One of her oldest students, a man named Saburo, who made pottery as a hobby, stopped coming to classes. Ume was surprised and disappointed. Saburo had been with her for years, was a dedicated student. She went to visit him to understand why he had stopped. She found Saburo at his home, working in a small studio he had set up in his garden. He was making a simple cup, working slowly, with obvious pleasure in the process. When he saw Ume, he smiled warmly. "Teacher, thank you for coming. Please sit. I wanted to ask why you've stopped attending classes." Saburo set down his tools and poured tea for both of them, using cups he had made himself. They were simple, a bit uneven, glazed in a plain grey. "I stopped because I remembered why I started," he said. "I began pottery because I loved working with clay. The feeling of it in my hands, the pleasure of making something useful. But your classes recently, they became about achieving, about becoming better, about reaching some standard." The joy was gone. Ume felt defensive. "But isn't improvement important? Shouldn't we strive to develop our skills?" "Perhaps. But I'm a rice merchant, not a master potter. I make pottery because it brings me peace. When it becomes another area of life where I'm not good enough, where I'm constantly striving to be better, it stops being peaceful. It becomes just more work." He picked up one of his simple grey cups. "I know this isn't sophisticated. I know it's not as refined as what you make or what other potters create. But I made it with my own hands, and it holds tea perfectly. For me, that's enough." Ume looked at the cup. It was plain, yes, but there was something honest about it. Something peaceful. She thought about her own work, about the sophisticated pieces she had been trying to create. They were technically better than what Saburo made, but had any of them been made with the simple contentment she saw in this humble cup? She realized something uncomfortable. She had been making pottery to prove something, to achieve something, to become someone more skilled. Saburo was making pottery because he enjoyed making pottery. She was striving. He was simply doing. "When did I lose that?" she asked quietly. "When did I stop enjoying the clay and start using it to chase some idea of who I should be?" Saburo poured more tea. "I think it happened gradually. You're very skilled, much more than me. But maybe that skill became a burden. Maybe you started thinking you should always be more skilled, always improving, always reaching higher." After that conversation, Ume began to notice her relationship with her craft. She saw how she had turned it into a constant evaluation, a never-ending project of self-improvement. She never just made pottery anymore. She was always trying to make better pottery, trying to achieve something, trying to prove something. She thought about when she had started 20 years ago. Back then, she had been content to make simple things. The pleasure had been in the making itself, in the feel of clay responding to her hands, in the satisfaction of creating something useful. When had that simple pleasure been replaced by this driven striving? She decided to try something different. For 1 month, she would make only the simplest pieces. Basic bowls and cups, nothing sophisticated or showy. And she would try to do it the way Saburo did, for the simple pleasure of working with clay rather than to achieve any particular result. The first week was difficult. Her mind kept criticizing the simple pieces. They were boring, basic, nothing special. She should be challenging herself, trying new things, developing her skills. But she stayed with the practice. By the second week, something began to soften. she noticed she was enjoying the work again. The feel of clay centering on the wheel, the way water helped her hands shape the form, the smell of earth. These simple pleasures had been there all along, but she had been too focused on achieving to notice them. She made dozens of simple bowls. Some came out well, some didn't. But she found she didn't care as much about the results. The pleasure was in the making. And interestingly, without trying so hard, her work began to have a quality it had lacked during her period of intense striving. A kind of ease, a simplicity that came from not forcing. Saburo came back to her classes. He noticed the change immediately. "You seem different," he said. "More like when I first started studying with you." "I am different. Or maybe I'm the same as I was before I started trying so hard to be different." She laughed at the confusion of the sentence. "I've been exhausting myself trying to become a better potter. I forgot that I was already a potter. That was enough." Years passed. Ume continued to develop her skills, continued to learn and grow. But the desperate quality was gone. She wasn't running towards some imagined version of herself that would finally be acceptable. She was simply working with clay, day by day, finding satisfaction in the work itself rather than in some future achievement. When students would push themselves too hard, criticizing their work harshly, she would tell them about her conversation with Saburo, about the month she spent making simple bowls, about discovering that striving can become a way of never being satisfied with where you are. "Skill develops naturally when you practice," she would say. "But if you're always focused on becoming more skilled, you miss the pleasure of the skill you already have. You miss the simple satisfaction of making something with your own hands. The striving keeps you always somewhere else, always in the future, never here where the clay actually is." Ume's experience shows another face of striving. She was good at pottery, but being good wasn't enough. She needed to be better, then better still. The goal kept receding because she kept moving it. Each level of skill achieved simply revealed another level to strive for. What she found in that month of simple work wasn't that skill doesn't matter. It's that the constant striving to be more skilled had separated her from the direct experience of making pottery. She was so focused on becoming that she couldn't simply be. Saburo's contentment came from a different place. He wasn't trying to be a master potter. He was enjoying being someone who makes pottery. The difference between those two orientations is vast. One involves constant dissatisfaction and striving. The other allows for present enjoyment. Notice that when Ume released the driven quality, her work actually improved. Not because she was trying harder, but because she was trying less hard. The striving had been creating tension that showed in her work. When she relaxed into simple making, something more genuine could emerge. Both Takuan and Ume discovered that what they were seeking wasn't far away, requiring years more effort to reach. It was here, in the present moment, available when the seeking stopped. Takuan found the awareness he was pursuing in intense meditation when he allowed himself to just sweep the courtyard. Ume found the satisfaction she was chasing through technical mastery when she returned to making simple bowls with presence. This is what Zen Buddhism points to again and again. The constant striving to be somewhere other than where we are creates the very dissatisfaction it's trying to solve. We think we'll finally be at peace when we achieve the next goal, reach the next level, become the next version of ourselves. but that peace is always postponed, always just ahead. What if you're already enough? Not perfect, not finished developing, but fundamentally complete right now. What if peace isn't at the end of some long journey of self-improvement, but here, available the moment you stop running? This doesn't mean you stop learning or growing. Both Taekwan and Ume continued to develop after their realizations. But they were no longer driven by a sense of not being enough. They could learn and grow from a foundation of already being whole rather than from a desperate attempt to become whole. The exhaustion many of us feel isn't from working hard. It's from constantly trying to be different than we are, constantly striving towards some imagined better version of ourselves. That exhaustion lifts not when we finally achieve enough, but when we recognize we already are enough. As you rest tonight, you might notice, if you've been carrying this burden, the endless project of self-improvement. The constant evaluation of whether you're good enough yet. The striving towards some version of yourself that will finally be acceptable. What would it be like to put that down, even just for tonight? To be exactly as you are, without needing to be different, better, more. To rest in the simple fact of being here, complete in this moment, nothing missing, nothing to achieve. We live with a persistent feeling that something is missing. Not enough time, not enough money, not enough success, not enough comfort. This sense of lack follows us through our days, creating a constant low-level anxiety. If only we had a bit more, we tell ourselves, then we could finally relax. So we work to acquire more. More possessions, more achievements, more experiences, more security. We believe we're building toward the point where we'll finally have enough and can rest. But that point never quite arrives. Each thing gained reveals another thing we lack. The finish line of enough keeps moving as we approach it. Zen Buddhism suggests something different. What if enough isn't an amount to achieve, but a way of seeing? What if the feeling of having enough comes not from acquiring more, but from recognizing what's already here? Not through getting what we lack, but through seeing clearly what we have. This isn't about settling for less or giving up on improving our circumstances. It's about recognizing that contentment doesn't come from accumulation. Someone with very little can feel abundant. Someone with great wealth can feel impoverished. The difference isn't in what they have, but in how they hold what they have. There's a peace that comes from recognizing enough. Not the peace of finally having everything we want, but the peace of seeing that we already have what we need. This moment, as it is, contains a fullness that constant acquiring can never provide. But we miss it because we're too busy looking at what's missing. The people in tonight's stories all discovered this shift from seeking more to appreciating what was already present. Not through losing what they had, but through seeing it clearly for the first time. In a prosperous town, there lived a silk merchant named Hideaki who had built a successful business over many years. He owned a large house, wore fine clothing, ate well, and had servants to manage his household. By any measure, he was wealthy and comfortable. Yet Hideaki felt a constant dissatisfaction. When he looked at his house, he saw the areas that needed improvement, compared it to larger houses he had visited. When he looked at his business, he thought about how it could be more profitable, how he could expand into new markets. When he attended social gatherings, he noticed who had finer clothing, better connections, more success. He worked long hours trying to grow his wealth. He made plans for expansion, for acquiring more property, for increasing his status. In his mind, there was always the next level to reach, the next acquisition that would finally make him feel secure and satisfied. One summer, Hideaki traveled to a mountain village to investigate opening a new trade route. The journey was longer than expected, and by evening he was still far from the village. Night was falling, and he had nowhere to stay. He came upon a small house at the edge of a forest. A man was sitting outside, an older farmer by the look of him, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Hideaki approached and asked if he might shelter there for the night. "Of course," the farmer said. "Please, come in. My wife will prepare food." The house was tiny, barely 2 rooms. The floor was packed earth, covered with worn mats. The walls were simple wood, gaps visible where the boards didn't quite meet. The furnishings were minimal. A low table, a few cushions, cooking pots by the fire. The farmer's wife served them a simple meal: rice, pickled vegetables, miso soup. They ate by the light of a single oil lamp. After the meal, Hideaki felt obliged to make conversation, though he found the poverty of the place uncomfortable. "Have you lived here long?" he asked. "My whole life," the farmer replied. "My father built this house. My son will inherit it when I'm gone. It must be difficult, living so simply. Do you not wish for more?" The farmer looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "More what?" "More comfort. A larger house. Better furnishings. Security. Ah, well, the house keeps the rain off our heads. We have a small plot that gives us rice and vegetables. There's a spring nearby with clean water. We have each other's company. What more would we need?" Hideaki almost laughed at the simplicity of the answer. "But don't you want to improve your situation? To have an easier life?" The farmer thought about this. "I suppose the house could be larger, but then we'd have more rooms to heat in winter, more space to clean. My life is already easy enough. I work in the morning, rest in the afternoon, share meals with my wife. In the evening, we sit and watch the mountains. This is a good life." "But what about security? What if you become ill and can't work?" "Then my neighbors will help as we help them when they need it. We've lived this way for generations. No one in this village goes hungry." Hideaki lay awake that night on the thin mat the farmer had provided, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. He thought about his own house, 10 times the size of this one, filled with fine things. He thought about his wealth, far exceeding what this farmer would see in a lifetime. Yet the farmer had seemed genuinely content. Not resigned to poverty, not pretending he didn't notice the simplicity of his life, but actually satisfied. He had spoken about his small plot of land, his simple house, his daily routine with real appreciation. He wasn't waiting for his life to improve so he could finally be happy. He was happy with the life he had. Hideaki, with all his wealth and comfort, could not say the same. He was always focused on what he didn't have yet, always comparing his situation to something better, always working toward more. When had he last felt genuine satisfaction with what he had? In the morning, the farmer's wife served a simple breakfast: rice, tea, pickled plum. Hideaki noticed things he had missed the night before. The care with which the wife prepared the food. The quality of attention the farmer gave to pouring tea. The way they spoke to each other with genuine warmth. These people had very little in the way of possessions, but they seemed rich in something he couldn't name. "Thank you for your hospitality," Hideaki said as he prepared to leave. "You've been very generous." "It's nothing. Safe travels." "May I ask you something?" "You seem content with your life. How is that possible, living so simply?" The farmer smiled. "I have everything I need. A roof, food, work that keeps me healthy, a wife I love, neighbors I trust, mountains to look at. Every morning I wake grateful. Every evening I go to sleep satisfied. What else is there?" Hideaki continued his journey, but the conversation stayed with him. Over the following days, as he traveled through mountain villages, he began noticing things differently. People who had very little by his standards, but who seemed to have a quality of contentment he had never achieved despite his wealth. When he returned home, his house looked different to him. Still fine, still comfortable, but somehow excessive. He had rooms he never entered. Clothing he never wore. Possessions he had forgotten he owned. He had been accumulating all this, believing it would bring satisfaction, but it had only brought the burden of maintaining and protecting it. He began to simplify. Not dramatically, not getting rid of everything, but gradually reducing what he owned to what he actually used and valued. As his possessions decreased, he expected to feel a sense of loss. Instead, he felt lighter. He changed how he ran his business. He still worked, still maintained his trade, but he stopped the constant drive to expand, to acquire more, to reach the next level. He had enough. His business provided well for his needs. Why exhaust himself pursuing more? His friends noticed the change and thought he was giving up on ambition. But Hideaki had discovered something they didn't understand. He wasn't giving up. He was arriving. After years of working toward enough, he had realized he had been living in enough all along. He just hadn't been able to see it because he was always looking ahead to more. Years later, when people would ask him about his success, he would tell them about the night he spent in the mountain farmer's house. "I had great wealth," he would say, "but that man was richer than I was. Not in possessions, but in satisfaction. He knew he had enough. I didn't. And that knowing made all the difference. Now I'm wealthy in both ways. I have comfortable means, and I know it's enough. That second wealth is the one that brings peace." Hideaki's experience shows how having more doesn't necessarily create the feeling of having enough. He had wealth, comfort, security, yet he felt a constant lack. The farmer had very little by comparison, yet felt abundance. The difference wasn't in their circumstances, but in their perception. The farmer wasn't pretending his life was easy or denying that more comfort would be pleasant. He simply recognized that what he had was sufficient. His small house did keep the rain off. His plot did provide food. His life did contain real satisfactions. Why spend his energy wishing for more when he could spend it appreciating what was present? Hideaki had been living in a future state of enough that never arrived. When I have this much, then I'll be satisfied. But each goal reached simply revealed another goal beyond it. The enough he was seeking was always just ahead, like the horizon that recedes as you approach it. The shift came not from acquiring more, but from seeing what he already had with clearer eyes. His house was comfortable. His business was successful. His life contained real pleasures and satisfactions. These things had been true all along, but he couldn't feel them because he was focused on what was still missing. When he began to simplify, reducing his possessions, he expected loss but found relief. This reveals something important. The things we accumulate believing they'll bring satisfaction often become burdens. They require maintenance, protection, space, attention. The having of them doesn't bring the peace we imagined. Sometimes the recognition of enough comes not through comparing ourselves to others, but through seeing our own abundance that we had been overlooking. In a village known for its gardens, there was a woman named Kiku who grew flowers to sell at the market. She had inherited a small plot of land from her parents and had spent years learning which flowers grew best in that soil, which colors people preferred, how to time plantings so she had blooms throughout the season. Her business was modest but steady. She made enough to live simply, to maintain her garden, to occasionally buy something she needed. She worked hard, especially during planting and harvest seasons, but she enjoyed the work and the quiet rhythm of her days. Then her cousin moved to the village. This cousin, Hana, had married a successful merchant and lived in a fine house in the next town. She would visit Kiku occasionally, always arriving with stories of her comfortable life, her travels, the interesting people she met, the lovely things her husband bought for her. At first, Kiku was happy for her cousin. But gradually, something shifted. When Hana would visit, Kiku began to see her own life differently. Her small house seemed shabby compared to Hana's descriptions of her home. Her simple life seemed boring compared to Hana's travels and social events. Her modest income seemed inadequate compared to Hana's wealth. She began to resent her work. The endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, selling. The same flowers year after year. The same market, the same customers. What had once felt peaceful began to feel like limitation. What had once been satisfying began to seem like barely getting by. She found herself thinking about all the things she didn't have. She couldn't afford nice clothing like Hana wore. She couldn't travel to other cities. She couldn't eat at fine restaurants or attend special events. Her life, which had felt full enough before, now seemed lacking. One morning, Kiku woke feeling particularly heavy with dissatisfaction. She went to her garden to begin the day's work, but her heart wasn't in it. She looked at the flowers without really seeing them, thinking instead about Hana's stories from her latest visit, about a festival in the capital, about new silk she had purchased. An old woman who lived nearby came walking past and paused at the garden gate. "Your iris are beautiful this year," the woman said. "May I come look at them?" Kiku nodded, barely paying attention. The woman walked slowly through the garden, stopping to examine different flowers, touching petals gently, bending to smell the bloom. She spent a long time looking at everything, clearly taking real pleasure in what she saw. "You have a gift," the woman said finally. "This garden is a treasure." "It's just flowers," Kiku replied. "Nothing special." "Nothing special? Look at this color." The woman gestured to a bed of blue iris. "Look at how they catch the morning light. And these?" She moved to pink peonies. "The way you've arranged them, the different heights, the colors together. This is beautiful work." "I suppose. But it's just what I do. Plant flowers, sell them, repeat every year." The old woman looked at her with sharp eyes. "I have lived a long life and seen many places. Gardens like this are not common. Most people don't have your skill or patience. You create beauty, and you do it so well that you've stopped noticing it. After the woman left, Kiku stood in her garden trying to see it the way the visitor had. She realized she hadn't really looked at her flowers in weeks. She had been too busy comparing her life to Hannah's, too focused on what she didn't have to notice what she did have. She walked through the garden slowly, the way the old woman had. She looked at the iris, really looked at them. The color was extraordinary, a blue so deep it was almost purple. The peonies were full and lush, their scent sweet in the morning air. The rows of different flowers created patterns of color that were genuinely lovely. She thought about the years she had spent learning to grow these flowers, understanding the soil, timing the seasons. She thought about the satisfaction of seeing seeds she planted become blooms. She thought about customers who would smile when they saw her flowers at the market, who would tell her how they brightened their homes. She had been dismissing all of this as just what I do, as if it had no value because it was familiar to her. But it did have value. She created beauty. She worked with living things. She had skills that had taken years to develop. She had work she actually enjoyed when she wasn't busy comparing it to someone else's life. Over the following weeks, Kiku practiced seeing her life the way that old woman had seen her garden. With fresh eyes, noticing what was actually there rather than filtering everything through what was lacking compared to Hannah's life. She noticed that she woke naturally with the sun, that her days had a rhythm that felt good in her body. She noticed that working with soil and plants left her feeling calm in a way she had never felt when visiting busy towns. She noticed the pleasure of watching things grow, of seeing her efforts result in beauty. She noticed her house, while simple, was comfortable and easy to maintain. She had enough space for what she needed, and she wasn't spending hours cleaning rooms she didn't use. She had neighbors she had known for years, people who would help if she needed it and whom she helped in turn. Her income was modest, yes, but she had enough. Food on her table, a solid roof, warm clothes for winter, a little extra to save. She wasn't wealthy, but she wasn't struggling either. She was living adequately, comfortably even, when she wasn't measuring her life against someone else's. The next time Hannah visited, Kiku listened to her stories with less resentment. She could appreciate that Hannah enjoyed her life without feeling that her own life was therefore inadequate. They were different lives, both with their own satisfactions and difficulties. "Don't you ever wish you had more?" Hannah asked at one point. "Your life seems so quiet." Kiku thought about this. "I used to, especially after your visits. I would think about all the things I didn't have. But I've realized that I have enough. This garden, this work, this life. It's enough for me. But don't you want to travel, see new places?" "Sometimes I'm curious about other places. But I'm also content here. There's always something new in the garden, even though it's the same ground every year. Different flowers each season, different light each day. I think I was looking so much at what I didn't have that I stopped seeing the richness of what I do have." Years passed, and Kiku continued her simple work with her flowers. Hannah continued her more elaborate life in town. Both were content in their different ways. Kiku never became wealthy, never traveled to distant places, never lived the kind of life Hannah had. But she had stopped feeling that her life was lacking because it was different. When younger gardeners would come to learn from her, struggling with their own feelings of dissatisfaction, she would tell them about the time when she couldn't see the beauty of her own garden. We're trained to always want more, she would say. To believe that satisfaction is always just ahead, in the next acquisition, the next achievement, the next change. But satisfaction isn't an amount to reach. It's a way of seeing what's already here. I grow the same flowers my mother grew on the same plot of land. Nothing dramatic or special. But when I see it clearly, it's enough. It's actually quite wonderful. The enough was here all along. Kiku's story shows how comparison can blind us to our own abundance. Before Hana's visits, Kiku had been content. She had enough and knew it. But exposure to her cousin's different life created a sense of lack that hadn't existed before. Suddenly, what had been sufficient seemed inadequate. This is what comparison does. It takes our actual situation, which may be perfectly workable, and makes it seem deficient by measuring it against something else. Kiku's life hadn't changed. Her circumstances were the same. But her perception of them shifted, and that shift created dissatisfaction where contentment had been. The old woman's visit was crucial because it offered a different perspective. She saw Kiku's garden with fresh appreciation because she wasn't taking it for granted. Her genuine delight in the flowers helped Kiku see them clearly again, to recognize the real value of what she had been dismissing as ordinary. The recognition of enough isn't about giving up on growth or change. Kiku could have chosen to pursue a different life if she wanted. But she discovered that the dissatisfaction she was feeling came not from genuinely wanting something different, but from comparing her situation to someone else's. When she saw her own life clearly, on its own terms rather than measured against another standard, she found it was actually quite satisfying. Both Hideaki and Kiku discovered enough, not by changing their circumstances, but by changing how they saw their circumstances. Hideaki had abundance, but couldn't feel it because he was focused on getting more. Kiku had sufficiency, but couldn't appreciate it because she was comparing it to something different. The shift from seeking more to recognizing enough is subtle but profound. It's not about settling for less or giving up on improvement. It's about seeing clearly what's actually present rather than filtering everything through what's missing. It's about appreciating what we have rather than only noticing what we lack. This recognition brings a particular kind of peace. Not the peace of finally having everything we want, which is always temporary because new wants arise. But the peace of being satisfied with what is, which can be present regardless of circumstances. The farmer in his simple house had it. Kiku in her garden had it. Hideaki found it when he stopped chasing more. That peace is available right now, in whatever circumstances you're in. Not by changing anything about your situation, but by seeing it without the constant measuring and comparing. By noticing what's actually here rather than focusing only on what isn't. By recognizing that enough isn't an amount to achieve, but a way of meeting what is. As you rest tonight, you might notice what you already have. Not in a forced gratitude exercise, but simply seeing what's present. The support beneath you. The breath moving easily. The simple fact of being alive, being here, being aware. These may seem like small things, ordinary things, but they're the foundation of everything. And when we see them clearly, they're enough. They're actually quite wonderful. They always have been. Tonight, you've traveled through some simple truths. You've seen how holding too tightly brings suffering, how trying to control everything creates tension, how comparing steals joy, how resentment poisons the one who carries it, and how living anywhere but now means missing your actual life. These aren't complicated teachings. They're observations about how suffering happens and how peace becomes possible. Not through achievement or effort, but through releasing what was never necessary to carry in the first place. You don't need to remember everything you've heard tonight. These understandings work in their own way, settling into awareness without force. What's meant to stay will stay. What's meant to help will help. As you settle more deeply now, let yourself release even these teachings. You don't need to hold on to anything. Not ideas, not insights, not even the stories you've heard. Everything can rest. Your breath continues on its own. Your body knows how to let go. The present moment is here, simple and complete, asking nothing of you. You can trust this moment exactly as it is. Whatever happened today can rest now. Whatever comes tomorrow will meet you when it arrives. Right now, there's only this gentle settling, this quiet release, this simple being here. Nothing to figure out. Nothing to fix. Nothing to become. Just this breath, this moment, this peaceful presence that was here all along, waiting beneath the noise. Let yourself sink into rest, held by something larger than your thoughts, something that's been here before you started listening and will be here when you wake. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.